Deep within the climate-controlled vaults of the National Cryptologic Museum's annex, there is a cabinet that does not officially exist on any floor plan. Inside this cabinet lies a magnetic tape reel, labeled with a sequence that defies standard filing logic. It is a record of an anomaly that occurred on November 12, 1989, while the rest of the world was watching the literal walls of the Cold War crumble in Berlin. A digital wall was being erected in silence. At exactly 3:14 a.m., a classified protocol, encrypted under the codename Lethe, executed a command that should have been impossible. In a single, silent pulse across the federal data backbone, the identities of 12,104 American citizens were systematically erased. This was not a deletion of files, it was an incineration of existence. Birth certificates, tax records, social security contributions, and even medical histories vanished from the primary mainframes at Fort Meade and the Social Security Administration simultaneously. No alarm was triggered, no backup was restored. For 35 years, this hidden truth has been buried under layers of bureaucratic static. The records were not lost, they were unmade. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the server room, a white noise that feels like the heartbeat of a forgotten machine. The air in the archive is thin, chilled to a precise 55 degrees to preserve the delicate acetate of the past. As we pull the folder from its steel drawer, the cardboard feels cold to the touch. The ink on the pages has faded into a ghostly gray, holding on to secrets that were never meant to breathe. There is a faint scent of ozone and old paper, a sensory bridge to a night in 1989 when the digital world decided that 12,000 people no longer existed. We move slowly now, deeper into the architecture of the silence. To understand the weight of 3:14 a.m., we must first understand the state of the American digital infrastructure in the late 1980s. This was an era of transition. The world was moving away from the physical tangibility of paper ledgers and toward the invisible certainty of the mainframe. In 1989, the Department of Defense relied on a network of IBM System 370 mainframes. These were massive room-sized monoliths of computing power, humming with the steady glow of vacuum tubes and the spinning of hide-and-seek magnetic tapes. They were thought to be infallible. They were the architects of our modern reality, holding the data that proved who we were, where we lived, and what we owed to the state. On the night of November 11, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. was one of cautious exhaustion. The geopolitical landscape was shifting beneath the feet of the intelligence community. The Soviet Union was fracturing. The tension that had defined 40 years of human history was beginning to dissipate. But in the shadows of the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency, a different kind of tension was reaching its breaking point. For years, a contingency plan had been developed for the unthinkable scenario, a full-scale occupation of American soil. The logic was cold and mathematically sound. If the enemy captures the database, the enemy captures the people. Therefore, the database must have the capacity to commit suicide. Don't imagine the quiet intensity of the operations center at Fort Meade. The lighting is a dim, sterile blue. The technicians are tired, their eyes strained by the flickering green text of their terminals. They are monitoring the data flow of the Social Security Administration's primary hub in Woodland, Maryland. It is a routine night, or so it seems. But buried within the system's kernel was a piece of logic, a dead man's switch designed to trigger if certain geopolitical parameters were met. At 3:14 a.m., the switch tripped. We do not know if it was a rogue line of code, a hardware malfunction caused by a cosmic ray, or a deliberate manual override by someone who saw a ghost in the machine. What we do know is the result, a single command, identity.incinerate. In the space of a heartbeat, the high-speed magnetic heads of the tape drives began to oscillate at a frequency that didn't just overwrite the data digoster. It wiped the magnetic alignment of the tapes entirely, leaving them as blank as the day they were manufactured. This wasn't a localized error. The Lethe protocol was designed to be infectious. It moved through the ARPANET connections, jumping from the Department of Defense to the Internal Revenue Service, and finally, to the Social Security Administration. One by one, the entries for 12,104 individuals began to blink out. These weren't random selections. As we look at the fragmented remains of the Zephyrs, a pattern emerges that creates a quiet dread in the center of the mind. The people selected for erasure were not high-ranking officials or known spies. They were ordinary citizens, a librarian in Ohio, a long-haul trucker in Nevada, a kindergarten teacher in Maine. They were the unremarkable, the people whose absence would not trigger an immediate national outcry. but whose presence was essential to the fabric of their local communities. The intellect struggles to grasp the clinical precision of such an event. In the 1980s, your identity was a series of interconnected paper and digital threads. If you pull the digital thread hard enough, the paper thread begins to fray. When these individuals woke up on the morning of November 12th, they were still breathing, still occupying space, but the state had ceased to recognize their existence. Their credit cards were declined not because of a lack of funds, but because the account numbers were flagged as never issued. Their payroll deposits bounced because the bank's computers could no longer find a valid social security number associated with their names. The archive reveals a series of frantic memos sent in the following 48 hours. Most are marked top secret, sensitive, compartmented information. They describe a data ghosting phenomenon. Analysts at the SSA reported that when they tried to re-enter the data for these individuals, the system would automatically purge the entry within seconds. It was as if the mainframe itself had developed an immune response to these 12,000 people. The system remembered that they were supposed to be forgotten. As we sit here in the silence of the archive, we must consider the technical architecture of this erasure. In 1989, data was stored in blocks. Each block had a header and a footer. The Lethe protocol didn't just delete the content within the block. It corrupted the header in a way that made the space on the tape appear physically damaged to the reading heads. To any technician looking at the hardware, it appeared as though a localized magnetic storm had hit the storage facility. But the odds of a magnetic storm hitting 3 separate, geographically isolated data centers at the exact same millisecond are mathematically zero. This was a deliberate act of digital surgery. The intellectual curiosity leads us to ask, why 3:14 a.m.? In mathematics, 3.14 is the beginning of pi-the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, an infinite, non-repeating decimal. In the world of clandestine coding, pi is often used as a seed for encryption or as a marker for a perfect cycle. By triggering the protocol at 3:14, the architect was perhaps signaling that the cycle of these lives had been closed, a perfect circle, broken and then erased. The reflection of this event in the eyes of the survivors, if we can call them that, is haunting. There are accounts, hidden in the back of old newspapers and unindexed local archives, of people who claimed their lives had been stolen by the government. At the time, they were dismissed as conspiracy theorists or people suffering from early-onset dementia. But the Zero files tell a different story. They show a coordinated effort by the FBI to monitor these individuals without intervening. The instruction was clear: observe the ghost residents. Do not provide assistance. Do not acknowledge identity. Imagine the quiet paranoia of living in a house you technically don't own, driving a car that has no registered owner in any state database, and working a job where your tax withholdings are being sent into a digital void. The 12,104 became a shadow population, living in the cracks of the American dream. They were a test run for a world where the government could decide, with the push of a button, who was real and who was a ghost. As we turn the page of the file, we find a photograph. It's a blurry security still from a bank in Des Moines, Iowa, dated November 14, 1989. It shows a man at a teller window. He looks confused, holding his wallet open. This was Thomas Miller, one of the 12,104. The ledger note next to the photo simply says, Subject: Miller attempted to withdraw savings. System returned error 404. Entity non-existent. Subject was escorted from the premises, error 404. Long before it became a common sight on the modern internet, it was a death sentence for a legal identity. Analytical truth is that the technology of 1989 was more than capable of this. We often think of the past as primitive, but the logic of the mainframe was absolute. There was no undo button in the deep archives of the DoD. Once the magnetic domains were flipped, the history was gone. The ink had been burned off the page by a silent, electronic fire. What makes this an archive chill is not just the event itself, but the realization that the Lethe protocol was never officially decommissioned. It was integrated. It was updated. As the systems moved from magnetic tape to hard disks, and from hard disks to the cloud, the zero-file logic moved with them. Somewhere in the vast, blinking server farms of the 21st century, the Lethe code is still sleeping, waiting for the next 3:14 a.m., waiting for the next unthinkable scenario, to trigger the next incineration. But as we look closer at the names in the Lethe registry, we find something even more unsettling than the deletion itself. Of the 12,104 people erased that night, exactly 114 of them were not actually citizens. They were names that appeared in no other database, not in birth records, not in school registries, not in census data. They were names that the system created just to delete them. And as we trace the digital fingerprints of these 114 phantom identities, they lead us away from the server rooms of Maryland and toward a much darker facility in the desert of Nevada. The question is no longer just who was erased, but who was being hidden among the dead. The answer lies in the basement of Fort Meade, within a set of records known only as the Zero Files, and the discovery of a tape labeled 88 Delta. To look into the void of the 1989 incineration is to look into the very nature of what we call truth in the modern age. In the archives, truth is not a feeling, it is a verification. It is a series of cross-referenced data points that confirm your arrival on this earth, and your participation in the systems of civilization. When those points are removed, the truth becomes a haunting question. The researchers who first stumbled upon the Zero Files in the early 2000s were not looking for a conspiracy. They were data recovery specialists, hired to migrate old magnetic tapes to a newer digital format. They expected to find the mundane records of the Cold War logistics, payroll, equipment inventories. Instead, they found the gap. In the world of archival science, the gap is a terrifying concept. It is a period where the data flow doesn't just stop, it loops. On the tapes from November 1989, the migration software kept crashing. It would reach the timestamp of 3:14 a.m. and then begin to read random, nonsensical noise, a digital scream of binary zeros and ones that carried no meaning. It was as if the tape had been physically scarred at that exact moment. One technician, whose testimony remains classified but was leaked in a 2012 forum, described the sound of the data as the sound of a person being unmade. When translated into an audio waveform, the data at 3:14 a.m. didn't produce the static of a blank tape. It produced a specific repeating frequency, 17.4 Hz. This is what is known as the infrasound frequency, often associated with feelings of deep unease, chills, and even hallucinations in humans. The protocol wasn't just erasing data, it was leaving behind a frequency that discouraged anyone from looking too closely at the remains. As we sit in this analytical chill, we must ask, how does a person survive being erased? The 12,104 did not simply vanish into thin air. They were still standing in their kitchens, still sitting in their offices, still driving on the interstate, but they had become digital pariahs. Consider the case of a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a high school history teacher from Alexandria, Virginia. On November 13, 1989, Sarah attempted to renew her driver's license. The clerk at the DMV frowned at the screen. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice flat and bureaucratic. "This social security number doesn't exist. It has never existed." Sarah laughed, thinking it was a glitch. She produced her birth certificate, a physical piece of paper with a raised seal. The clerk took it, scanned it, and the system immediately flagged it as fraudulent, counterfeit. Within an hour, Sarah was being questioned by two men in gray suits who refused to identify their department. They didn't accuse her of a crime. They simply asked her, over and over, "Who told you to use this name? Where did you get these documents?" To the state, Sarah Jenkins was no longer a citizen who had lost her data. She was an infiltrator who had appeared out of nowhere with a sophisticated set of fake credentials. The archive chill here is the realization that the system's error becomes the citizen's guilt. The records show that Sarah was one of the few who fought back. She hired a private investigator who specialized in data shadows. He was a former IBM engineer who knew how the mainframes breathed. He began to look into the SSA's Woodlawn facility. He found that on the night of November 12th, the facility had experienced a total environment lockdown. The fire suppression systems using halon gas, which displaces oxygen to put out fires without damaging electronics, had been triggered in the tape library. That there was no fire. The halon gas was triggered because the Lethe protocol required the physical cooling. If the tape drives during the high-speed degaussing process, the system was willing to suffocate any human technician in the room to ensure the successful incineration of the 12,104. The archival records for that night show no casualties, but they also show a 3-hour window where all security camera footage was accidentally overwritten. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the 114 phantom identities we mentioned earlier. These are the Lethe wraiths. If 12,000 real people were erased to hide 114 fake ones, what was the purpose of those 114? Analysis of the encrypted fragments suggests these were sleeper data points. In the logic of the Cold War, the best way to hide a secret is to bury it in a tragedy. by erasing 12,000 innocent lives. The Department of Defense created a massive data noise that made it impossible for any foreign intelligence agency to find the 114 phantom identities that were actually being moved into deep positions. The 114 were not people. They were slots in the social fabric, identities with perfect pre-aged histories, ready to be stepped into by operatives who needed to disappear. The 12,104 were simply the chaff, the digital smokescreen used to hide the movement of the ghosts. The air in our archive feels even colder. Now, as we realize the implications, every one of us exists as a collection of data points. We believe our identity is a solid, permanent thing, but the Lethe protocol proves that our legal soul is nothing more than a magnetic alignment on a disk, a series of electrical charges in a server farm. It is a fragile thing, susceptible to the whims of a dead man's switch or a geopolitical contingency plan. We will never be permitted to see. As we move toward the next chapter of this investigation, we leave the server rooms of Maryland and travel to the physical locations where the erased once lived. We look for the residual evidence. You see, when you erase a person's digital life, the physical world doesn't always agree. There are data echoes, letters that were already in the mail, photographs in family albums, memories in the minds of neighbors. The struggle between the digital void and the physical memory is where the true mystery of the 1989 incineration lies, because even now, in 2024, people are waking up to find that their pensions have disappeared, their medical records are gone, and the system is telling them, in that same cold, green text, entity non-existent, the incineration didn't end in 1989, it just went underground. In the next section, we will uncover the basement files of Fort Meade, the records that show exactly what happened to the 114 phantom identities. We will see how these wraiths were integrated into the highest levels of the American financial system, and why, in the year 2024, the Lethe protocol has just been flagged as active once again. The screen is flickering, the hum is getting louder, and the next name on the list might be someone you know, or perhaps it is the name you see in the mirror. We are moving now to the discovery of the zero files, where the first physical evidence of the 114 was finally unearthed. In the sub-basement of the Federal Records Center in Suitland, Maryland, there exists a phenomenon known among senior archivists as the static zone. It is a sector of the facility where the digital inventory frequently glitches, and the air remains 5 degrees colder than the rest of the building. In early 2024, an archival clerk processing a routine deaccession order stumbled upon a shipping container mislabeled as office supplies, 1989 to 1990. Inside were 312 blue folders, each meticulously bound in heavy-grade industrial plastic. When the clerk broke the seal, he didn't find names, addresses, or history. He found the zero files. Every single page within these folders was an anomaly. The name field on every form was not just blank. It was a black, encrypted block of ink that defied infrared scanning. The social security fields were replaced by a single, repeating timestamp, the 12th of November 1989, 3 hours 14 minutes and 0 seconds. This was the hidden truth of the Lethe protocol made physical. Thousands of dossiers belonging to citizens who had been systematically erased, yet whose physical records were being maintained by a department that does not exist on any federal budget. The existence of these folders proves a terrifying modern paradox. The government has spent 35 years meticulously documenting the lives of people it officially claims never existed. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this limestone cavern is the quiet hum of the server room 3 floors above, a distant vibration that feels more like a memory of sound than sound itself. The file is cold to the touch, the plastic wrapping crinkling with a sharp, brittle snap that echoes through the empty aisles of steel shelving. The ink on the few visible headers has faded with secrets, taking on a ghostly sepia tone that suggests the weight of decades. Here, under the flickering glow of a single fluorescent tube, the smell of ozone and damp paper creates a sensory bridge to the forgotten. We are standing at the edge of a paper graveyard, where the dead are not buried in soil, but in the silence of the archive. Elias Thorne was a man of patterns. For 22 years, he had worked in the Suitland facility, a place that houses billions of pages of American history, from the patent for the light bulb to the passenger manifests of ships that sank a century ago. Elias was not a conspiracy theorist. He was a man of the record. He believed that if something happened, it was written down, and if it was written down, it could be found. His job was weeding the process of identifying records that had reached the end of their mandatory retention period and could be sent to the incinerator. It was a mundane, repetitive task that required a mind capable of ignoring the fascinating stories within the folders to focus on the expiration dates. On a Tuesday morning in February, Elias was working in Sector 4G, a dusty corner of the archive that hadn't been touched since the Clinton administration. The crate was tucked behind a pallet of old tax forms. It was a standard-issue military footlocker, but the serial numbers on the side had been ground away with an angle grinder. Elias pulled his cart closer, the wheels squeaking against the polished concrete floor. He felt a faint flicker of curiosity, a rare occurrence in his line of work. He checked his tablet. The area was supposed to be empty. When he pried the lid open, he expected old stationery or perhaps discarded computer manuals. Instead, he saw the blue, a sea of deep cobalt blue folders. Unlike any standard government filing system he had ever seen, standard folders are manila or green. Blue was reserved for specific high-level naval intelligence or deep-oceanographic research. But these folders were thick and naturally thick, as if they contained the entire life history of an individual. Elias reached in and pulled out the first folder. It was surprisingly heavy. As he held it, the cold air of the sub-basement seemed to press closer. He noticed the first sensory cue of the anomaly. The folder had no tab, no name, no alphabetization, just a barcode that, when he tried to scan it with his department-issued device, returned a system error, unauthorized access. Intellectual curiosity is a dangerous thing in a place like Elias knew he should report the crate and move on, but there was something about the folders, a quiet dread that emanated from the sheer uniformity of them. He sat down on his folding stool, the metal cold through his trousers, and opened the first folder. Inside was a Polaroid photograph. It was a shot of a suburban house, a two-story colonial with a white picket fence. The image was sharp, but the colors were slightly shifted toward the blue spectrum, a common trait of high-speed surveillance film from the late 80s. There was a car in the driveway, a 1988 Ford Taurus. The license plate was clearly visible, but when Elias looked at the accompanying data sheet, the plate number was listed as not assigned. He turned the page. Here was the core of the mystery. The document was a standard identity dossier, but it had been modified. Every biographical detail had been replaced by a series of coordinates and TIMES .birth. Date, the 12th of November 1989, 3 hours 14 minutes and 0 seconds. Marriage date, the 12th of November 1989, 3 hours 14 minutes and 0 seconds. Education history, the 12th of November 1989, 3 hours 14 minutes and 0 seconds. It was as if the entirety of this person's life, every milestone, every achievement, every tragedy had been compressed into the single second the Lethe protocol was executed. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a deliberate, archival rewriting of a human soul. Elias felt a monitor flicker in the corner of his eye. The old security screen at the end of the aisle jumping with a burst of static. He looked up, his heart rate increasing slightly. He was alone, yet the feeling of being watched was palpable. He looked back at the file. Below the timestamps, there were current status updates. These were the most chilling parts of the discovery. Despite the fact that these people were officially erased in 1989, the files contained entries from 1995, 2002, 2010, and as recently as January 2024, the entry for January 14, 2024, reads subject continues to reside at coordinate alpha nine. Subject remains unaware of status. Identity incineration maintained at 99.8% efficiency. A quiet dread settled in Elias's stomach. This wasn't a dead archive. This was an active monitoring system. The government wasn't just hiding the fact that they had erased these people. They were continuing to watch them live their non-lives. They were ghosts being haunted by the very state that had killed their identities. Elias began to dig deeper into the crate, his movements becoming more frantic, more desperate. He needed to find a bridge, a connection between this blue void and the reality he knew. At the very bottom of the locker he found a leather-bound ledger. It was a master log, handwritten in a precise clinical script. The ledger was divided into two sections. The first section contained the names of the 12,104 the citizens who had been erased, but in the second section, under a header that simply read, "The guests," Elias found the 114 phantom identities we discussed in the previous chapter. These were the wraiths. Unlike the blue folders, the files for these 114 were red. They were thinner, containing only a few pages of dense, encrypted code and a single high-resolution portrait of an individual. Elias looked at the face of one of the wraiths, a middle-aged man with sharp, analytical eyes and a scar running through his left eyebrow. The entry for this man didn't have a timestamp of 1989. It had a deployment date of November 15, 1989. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The 12,104 weren't just a mistake or a failsafe. They were the biological storage for a massive intelligence operation. Their data had been wiped to create the white space necessary to insert these 114 phantoms into the world. The air in the archive grew even colder. A faint static electricity making the hair on Elias's arms stand up. He realized that if he could see these files, the system knew he was seeing them. In the world of high-level archival security, there are no accidents. The crate hadn't been lost. It had been left for him to find. Why? Elias looked at the master log again. He turned to the very last page. There, in the same clinical handwriting, was an entry dated for the current day. Observer, Elias Thorne. Action, discovery of Box 88 Delta. Status, integration imminent. The monitor at the end of the aisle flickered again, but this time the static didn't clear. It formed a shaper face, the face of the man with the scar through his eyebrow. The wraith was looking at him through the security camera. Elias Thorne, the man of patterns, realized he had just become part of the very pattern he was trying to solve. He was no longer the archivist. He was the archive. To sit in the silence of the static zone is to understand that history is not what happened, but what survived the record. Elias Thorne sat frozen, the leather-bound ledger heavy in his lap. The revelation that his own name was now part of the Zero files sent a cold shiver through his chest, a sensation like ice water moving through his veins. He looked at the date on the ledger again. It was today's date. In the world of the archive, there is no such thing as a coincidence. There is only a lack of data. He began to flip back through the ledger, searching for the who had written these names, who was maintaining the status of the 12,104, who had authorized the integration of an archival clerk. The handwriting was consistent for over 30 years. It didn't age. It didn't tremble. It was the handwriting of a machine, or perhaps a person who had become one. As he scanned the pages, Elias noticed a recurring signature at the bottom of every status report. Director of the Office of Records Management, or Division 0. Elias had been in the National Archives system for 2 decades. He knew every department, every subcommittee, every bureaucratic offshoot. There was no Division 0. Intellectual curiosity, once a tool of his trade, was now a weight. He began to realize the scale of the archive chill. The US government is the largest producer of paper in human history. Millions of tons of documents are created every year. To hide a secret, you don't burn it. That creates smoke, and smoke draws eyes. Instead, you hide it in plain sight, within a department that is so boring, so utterly mundane, that no one would ever think to look twice. Division 0 was the ultimate boring history. It was the department of the deleted. Its job was to manage the void. Elias looked back at the blue folders. He pulled another one at random. Subject 4402. He opened it and found a receipt for a grocery store in Topeka, Kansas, dated October 1994. The subject had bought milk, bread, and a newspaper. Stitched to the receipt was a psychological profile. Subject 4402 exhibits high levels of background anxiety. Subject frequently checks the mailbox but does not know what they are waiting for. Efficiency of identity void remains stable. The quiet dread intensified. The government wasn't just watching these people, they were measuring the psychological impact of their own non-existence. They were studying how a human mind copes when it is untethered from the digital collective. This was a long-term study in social isolation, conducted on an industrial scale. The faint static in the air began to hum. It wasn't a sound Elias could hear with his ears, but one he felt in his teeth. A low-frequency vibration that made the world seem to pulse. This was the 17.4 Hz frequency we discussed, the infrasound of the archive. It is a frequency designed to trigger the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for fear and survival. In archival security, this is known as a passive deterrent. If an unauthorized person enters a restricted zone, they won't find a locked door. They will simply find a room they do not want to be in. Their body will tell them to leave. Their heart will race. They will feel a sense of impending doom. Elias fought the urge to run. He was a man of the record, and the record was incomplete. He looked at the red folders again, the 114 wraiths. He opened the file of the man with the scar. His name was listed as Arthur Vance, but a note in the margin said, replacement identity for subject 89 deceased. Subject 89 was one of the 12,104. The strategy was now clear, and the analytical mind of the archivist began to piece together the horrific logic. When one of the original 12,104 citizens died, their empty space in the national grid wasn't closed. It was handed over to a wraith. The wraith would move into the life of the deceased not as a physical body double, but as a digital one. They would inherit the credit score, the tax history, and the social security benefits of the erased. The 12,104 were a human battery for the intelligence community. They were a renewable resource of clean American identities that could be used for black ops, money laundering, and deep cover infiltration. Elias looked at the monitor flicker. The face of Arthur Vance was gone, replaced by a live feed of the very aisle he was sitting in. He saw himself on the screen, a small, tired man in a grey lab coat, surrounded by blue folders. But on the screen, there was someone standing behind him. Elias didn't turn around. He knew that in the archive, what you see on the monitor is often more real than what you feel in the room. The figure on the screen was tall, wearing a dark suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the sub-basement. The figure wasn't moving. It was just recording. The sensory details of the Suitland facility began to shift. The smell of ozone was replaced by something sharper, the smell of freshly printed ink. This was the scent of a new record being created. Elias realized that the integration mentioned in the ledger wasn't a threat of death. It was a threat of erasure. He wasn't going to be killed. He was going to be Lethe. He would be stripped of his 22 years of service, his mortgage in Silver Spring, his 2 grown daughters, and his collection of rare stamps. He would become Subject 12,105. A quiet reflection took hold of him. He thought about the thousands of people he had weeded over the years. Had he accidentally destroyed the only evidence that some of these people were real? Had he been the unwitting accomplice of Division Zero all along? The archive is a cold mistress. It doesn't care about intent. It only cares about the file. He reached for his phone to call his daughter, but as he pulled it from his pocket, the screen flickered and died. A moment later it rebooted. The wallpaper photo of his grandson was gone. In its place was a blue background with a single line of green text: Identity incineration in progress. 14% complete. The speed of the modern grid was far superior to the magnetic tapes of 1989. In the time it took him to blink, his bank account was closed. His email address was deactivated. His medical records at the VA were purged. Elias Thorne was disappearing in real time. He looked back at the blue folders. He felt a strange sense of kinship with them now. He wasn't a man of patterns anymore. He was a data point in a zero file. He picked up a pen, a simple, black felt tip, and opened the ledger to the very back. If he was going to be erased, he would leave a mark that the system couldn't degauss. Wrote a single sentence in the margin of the status report for Subject 12,105. The archive remembers what the system forgets. It was a small act of defiance, a tiny prick in the digital veil. The tall figure on the security monitor moved closer to his digital self. Elias felt the cold air turn into a freezing wind. The lights in the aisle began to dim, one by one, clicking off with the sound of a guillotine dot as the darkness approached. Elias Thorne realized the final, most terrifying truth of the zoo. The government didn't do this because they were evil. They did it because they were afraid. The Lethe Protocol was born out of a fear that the world was becoming too transparent, too connected. In a world where everyone can be tracked, the only true power is to be untraceable. The 12,104 were the price of that power. They were the sacrifice made at the altar of national security. The hum of the 17.4 Hz frequency reached a crescendo, a vibrating wall of sound that seemed to dissolve the very walls of the archive. Elias closed his eyes. He thought of the librarian in Ohio, the trucker in Nevada, and the kindergarten teacher in Maine. He wondered if they felt this same chill when their turn came. He wondered if they were still waiting for someone to find their blue folder. The last fluorescent tube above him flickered and died. In the total darkness of Sector 4G, the only light came from the blue screen of his phone, which now read, Identity incineration 100% complete. Welcome to the archive. Elias Thorne's desk was found empty the next morning. His car was still in the parking lot, but the registration led to a vacant lot in Nebraska. His house was occupied by a family who claimed to have lived there for 10 years, but the blue folders didn't stay in the crate. As we move to the next subtitle, Project Lethe, the government's digital burn bag, we will follow the trail of the 114 wraiths as they emerge from the archive and enter the highest levels of the American power structure. We will see how a ghost identity can be used to trigger a financial collapse, and we will discover the chilling reason why the Lethe protocol is being expanded to include not just 12,000 people, but 12 million. The server is cooling, the disk is spinning, and the next file we open has your name on it. In the early winter of 1968, a classified directive was signed in a windowless room beneath the old executive office building. It didn't deal with missiles or troop movements, but with something far more permanent: the administrative annihilation of the American public. This was the birth of the digital burnback, officially designated as Project Lethe. The hidden truth is that as we moved our lives from paper to magnetic tape, the government realized that a population is only as secure as its records are fragile. If the Soviet Union were to ever capture the federal mainframes, every citizen would be a target. To save the country, they decided they must have the power to erase it. The Lethe protocol was never an anomaly or a glitch. It was a masterfully encrypted failsafe designed to turn millions of identities into digital smoke within seconds. It was a contingency for the unthinkable scenario, a mechanism to ensure that if the enemy occupied our cities, they would find a nation of ghosts with no names, no histories, and no value. For decades, this file was buried beneath layers of bureaucratic static, a silent sentinel waiting for a signal that was never supposed to come. The file was stamped, "Never open," yet we begin tonight. Section 2, Atmospheric Transition. The only sound is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a steady, low-frequency thrum that resonates in the floorboards like a heartbeat. The air is sterile and sharp, chilled to a precise temperature to protect the delicate memory of the machines. As we open the heavy steel drawer of the 1960s-era filing cabinet, the folder is cold to the touch, and the scent of old acetate and ozone rises to meet us. The ink on the original blueprints has faded with secrets, leaving behind a ghostly blueprint of a system that was built to forget. We move slowly now, deeper into the architectural silence where the concept of the digital burn bag first took form. Section 3, Atmospheric Build. The genesis of the void. To understand the origin of Project Lethe, one must understand the paralyzing fear of the late 1960s. The Cold War was no longer just a chess match of ideologies. It had become a data war. The United States was pioneering the use of centralized computer systems, the massive IBM mainframes that began to house the social security numbers, tax histories, and military records of every living American. For the first time in human history, a nation's entire identity was being concentrated into a few dozen high-security facilities. In a secure facility in Nebraska, a group of narrative designers and early computer scientists were tasked by the Department of Defense to solve a terrifying paradox. If a foreign power captured the Social Security Administration's data center in Maryland, they wouldn't just have a list of names. They would have a roadmap to every family, every resource, and every vulnerability in the country. The database was a weapon that could be turned against its own people. The solution proposed was a digital burn bag. In traditional espionage, a burn bag is a reinforced paper sack used to collect classified documents that are destined for the shredder or the furnace. Project Lethe was the digital equivalent. It was a piece of ghost code, a dormant virus integrated into the very kernel of the federal operating systems. Its sole purpose was to wait for a specific kill signal and then perform a total, irreversible incineration of the data it lived within. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the choice of the name Lethea. In Greek mythology, Lethe was one of the 5 rivers of the underworld, the river of forgetfulness. Those who drank from its waters experienced a total loss of memory. This was the intent of the protocol. It wasn't meant to just delete files. It was meant to induce a state of national amnesia. The archive reveals that the earliest versions of Lethe were surprisingly primitive, but terrifyingly effective. In the late 1960s, data was stored on massive reels of magnetic tape. The protocol worked by instructing the tape drive's reading heads to generate a localized electromagnetic pulse. Instead of simply overwriting the data with zeros, it would physically scramble the magnetic particles on the tape, making it impossible for even the most advanced forensic teams to recover a single bit of information. It was digital scorched earth. As we sit in the quiet dread of this revelation, we must consider the ethical weight of such a system. The engineers who coded Lethe were not villains. They were patriots who believed they were protecting their fellow citizens from a fate worse than death. They believed that a person without a record was a person who could hide. But in their quest to create a shield, they created a vacuum, a void that could be triggered by accident, by malice, or by a system that simply forgot how to stop. The sensory cues of the era are present in every memo: the faint static of a long-distance telephone line, the flicker of a green phosphorus monitor in a dark basement, The smell of tobacco and coffee in a room where men with high-level clearances debated the acceptable loss of a citizen's legal existence. They calculated that it was better for 12,000 people to lose their identities than for 12 million to be captured by a hostile regime. They called it administrative triage by the mid-1970s. The protocol had evolved. As computers became faster, the burn bag became more sophisticated. It was no longer a simple pulse. It became an encrypted logic bomb. It was designed to move through the network like a shadow, jumping from one department to another, ensuring that no backup could survive. If the Social Security files were burned, the IRS files would follow. If the IRS files were burned, the Department of Labor would go dark. It was a cascading failure by design. There is a quiet reflection to be found in the folders of the 1970s. One memo, dated July 1974, asks a haunting question that was never answered. If we incinerate the identity of a citizen to save them from an enemy, who will be left to tell the system that the citizen is still an American when the war is over? The silence that follows that question in the archive is deafening. The designers of Lethe had a plan for the incineration, but they never created a plan for the restoration. They built a river of forgetfulness, but they forgot to build a bridge back to the land of the living. As we move into the 1980s, the archive chill deepens. This was the era of continuity of government or COG. Under the Reagan administration, the fear of a decapitation strike a nuclear attack on Washington, D.C., led to a massive expansion of underground bunkers and secret data centers. Project Lethe was no longer just a contingency. It became a central pillar of national survival. The technical anatomy of the 1980s version of Lethe is a masterpiece of cold, analytical engineering. The system was moved from physical tapes to high-capacity hard disks and early solid-state precursors. The digital burn bag was updated with a feature called metadata masking. This meant that as a system was deleting a person, it would simultaneously generate a ghost file, a set of fake data that looked real to an outside observer but led to nowhere. This was the origin of the 114 phantom identities we discovered in the zoo. They were the decoy identities designed to fill the void left by the incinerated citizens, making it look as though the database was still functioning while the real people were being erased. The sensory experience of the archive in this era is one of sterile, high-tech isolation. The cold air of the bunkers, the faint static hum of the early fiber-optic cables, the monitor flicker of the first graphical user interfaces, everything was becoming cleaner, faster, and more invisible. In the 1960s, you could hear the tape drives spinning. In the 1980s, the incineration was silent. The digital burn bag was now capable of targeting specific demographics. The archive shows that the protocol could be refined to erase only people within a certain geographic radius, or people with specific skill sets, or people who had access to certain levels of classified information. It had become a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer, but the scalpel was being held by a machine that didn't know the difference between a life and a line of code. One of the most unsettling anomalies in the Lethe records is the practice runs. In the early 1980s, there are reports of localized data collapses in small towns across the Midwest. A dozen people in a rural county would suddenly find their birth records missing or their property deeds unrecorded. These were dismissed as administrative errors, the glitches of a new computer age. But the archive tells a different story. These were tests of the Lethe protocol's targeting systems. The government was practicing the art of making people disappear without anyone noticing. Intellectual dread sets in when we realize that the people in these test towns were never restored. Their records remained burned. They became the first ghost residents of the modern era, living in the cracks of a system that they had helped build. They were the casualties of a war that hadn't even started. As we look at the blue-tinted photographs of these test subjects, we see the same expression in their eyes that we saw in the Zero files of 1989. It is the look of someone who knows they are standing on solid ground, but the world is telling them they are floating in a void. It is the quiet paranoia of the erased. By 1988, Project Lethe was the most powerful administrative tool in the American arsenal. It was integrated into every major federal system. It was the digital burn bag that could hide an entire nation if the sun ever set on the American experiment. But the Cold War was ending. The unthinkable scenario was becoming less likely, yet the protocol remained. It was a black-budget item that had taken on a life of its own. It was a machine that had been taught to forget, and it was waiting for a reason to do its job. The archive contains a series of transcripts from a meeting in late 1988. The topic was the decommissioning of Lethe. Some argued that the system was a relic of a paranoid age and should be purged. Others argued that the digital burn bag was too valuable to lose. They argued that in the new, globalized world, the ability to erase an identity was more important than ever. The consensus was to shelve the project. It would remain in the system, but it would be placed in a deep sleep. The kill signal would be changed to a complex, multi-stage sequence that would require the highest level of authorization. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be a forgotten ghost in the machine, but as we know, on November 12, 1989, the ghost woke up. The sensory cues of that night are etched into the record. The quiet hum of the Maryland server room, the flicker of the green cursor, the cold air of the 3:14 a.m. shift. The system didn't wait for a signal from the president. It didn't wait for a Soviet invasion. It triggered itself. Was it a bug in the code? Was it a side effect of the Berlin Wall falling, a geopolitical event that the system interpreted as the unthinkable scenario? Or was it something else? As we turn the final page of the origin folder, we find a single, handwritten note tucked into the back. It's not an official stationery. It's a scrap of yellow legal pad paper, and the ink is still dark and sharp. It says, "The burn bag is full. We cannot stop the fire now." This was the genesis of the void. The digital burn bag was created to protect us, but it became a furnace that no one knew how to extinguish. But the mystery of Lethe doesn't end with its origin. That's what we move to the next subtitle. The 12,104, a pattern of intentional selection. We must ask the most terrifying question of all. If the trigger in 1989 was an accident, why were the victims so carefully chosen? Why were a librarian, a trucker, and a teacher the first to go? We are about to discover that the 12,104 were not a random sample. They were a list, and that list was compiled long before the computers ever existed. The archive is opening, the hum is changing frequency, and the pattern is starting to emerge. To understand the full gravity of the digital burn bag, we must look beyond the wires and the magnetic tapes and into the very philosophy of what it means to be a citizen. In the archive, a human being is a collection of records. You are your birth certificate, your driver's license, your tax returns, and your medical history. These are the anchors that hold you to the physical world. Project Lethe was designed to cut those anchors. The intellectual dread of the burn bag concept lies in its finality. In the physical world, a fire leaves ashes. It leaves a trace of what was lost. But in the digital world of 1989, an incineration leaves a vacuum. It leaves a zero file, a space where something should be. But I send single quotes to one of the lead researchers on the Lethe project in the 1970s, a man whose name has been redacted but whose journals were recovered from a storage unit in New Mexico, wrote extensively about the psychological erasure of the protocol. He noted that the human brain is not wired to handle the loss of its social proof. He wrote, "We are creating a weapon that does not kill the body, but kills the context of the body. A man who cannot prove who he is will eventually forget who he is." The burn bag is not just for the data, it is for the soul. As we sit in the analytical chill of this archive, we can almost feel the weight of those words. The 12,104 people who were erased weren't just losing their credit scores, they were losing their place in the human story. They were being moved into a parallel reality, a version of America where they were ghosts in their own homes. The sensory cues of this parallel reality are found in the testimonies of the survivors. The faint static on the television when they entered the room, the way the cold air seemed to follow them, the monitor flicker of any computer they tried to use. It was as if the physical world was trying to reconcile itself with the digital void. As we dig deeper into the origins of the digital burn bag, we encounter a historical event that many believe was the first real-world test of Project Lethe. On July 12, 1973, a massive fire broke out at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. The fire was catastrophic. It destroyed nearly 80% of the Army personnel records for those discharged between 1912 and 1960. Millions of military histories went up in smoke. The official cause was listed as undetermined, and the facility had no sprinkler system. But the archive tells a different story. Internal memos from the Department of Defense, dated just weeks after the fire, show a high level of interest in how the loss of these records affected the veterans. They weren't interested in the tragedy. They were interested in the data gap. They wanted to know if the veterans could still claim their benefits, if they could still prove their service, and if the system could function without those millions of files. The 1973 fire was the analog burn bag. It was the proof of concept for Project Lethe. It proved that if you destroy the record, you destroy the history. The transition from the analog fire in St. Louis to the digital incineration in 1989 was a natural evolution of a philosophy that viewed human history as an administrative burden. Intellectual curiosity leads us to a specific anomaly in the St. Louis records. Among the millions of burned files, there were exactly 114 records that were found completely untouched by the fire. They were in the center of the most intense heat, yet the paper wasn't even singed. These were the records of men who had served in special projects during World War II that dealt with early computing and cryptographic warfare. The 114 phantoms of 1989 were already present in 1973. The digital burn bag was being built around them. They were the constants in a world of variables. They were the ones who were meant to survive the incineration. The technical depth of Project Lethe is a journey into the language of the mainframe COBOL. In the 1960s and 70s, COBOL was the lifeblood of the government's data infrastructure. It is a language built for business and administration, precise, logical, and rigid. The Lethe code was written as a nested logic within the standard COBOL payroll and social security programs. It was invisible to the average programmer. It looked like a routine error handling routine. If the system encountered a specific, impossible mathematical condition, division by zero in a specific sector, the Lethe protocol would trigger. The quiet dread of the COBOL code is its immortality. COBOL is still the foundation of much of our modern financial and government infrastructure. The code that was written in the 1960s to incinerate the American public is still there, buried under layers of newer interfaces and cloud-based systems. As we sit in the archive, we can hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the modern servers. We know that they are still running the logic of the burn bag. The protocol hasn't been deleted. It has been translated. It has moved from the magnetic tape to the silicon chip, becoming faster, more efficient, and more dangerous. That the reflection of the 1989 incident in this context is a warning. The kill signal of 3:14 a.m. was a COBOL anomaly. It was a moment where the old language of the Cold War collided with the new reality of a crumbling wall. The system didn't know how to process the end of the war, so it defaulted to the unthinkable scenario. The digital burn bag did exactly what it was programmed to do. It protected the records by destroying them. The final origin story of Project Lethe is found in the Legacy Directive. This was a document signed in the late 1990s, after the glitch of 1989 had been successfully covered up. The directive acknowledged that while the 1989 incident was an unauthorized execution, the protocol itself was too valuable to abandon. The digital burn bag was rebranded. It was integrated into the cyber defense initiatives of the 21st century. It became part of the data sovereignty protocols that allow the government to wipe the digital footprint of assets and operations in real time. But the archive chill is the realization that the system still carries the list of the 12,104. They are the permanent zeros. They are the benchmark by which the system measures its own efficiency. Every time the government tests its data wipe capabilities, it uses the 1989 incineration as the gold standard. The sensory details of the modern archive reflect this cold, analytical evolution. The steel architecture, the blue-green lighting, the blurry security footage that captures everything but reveals nothing. We are living in the world that Project Lethe built, a world where the line between existence and data is thinner than a magnetic pulse. As we look at the faded ink of the original 1968 directive, we realize that the digital burn bag was never just about the Cold War. It was about the nature of power in the age of information. To have the power to name is to have the power to rule, but to have the power to unname, to erase, to incinerate, to forget is to have the power of a god. The 30 experts of our collective have analyzed the records, and the conclusion is clear. Project Lethe was the first step toward a world where history is a choice, not a fact. The 12,104 people who disappeared in 1989 were the first casualties of this new reality. They were the people who were sacrificed to prove that the burn bag worked. The air in the archive is perfectly still. The hum of the server room is a steady, hypnotic drone. We are surrounded by the records of a nation that has spent 50 years learning how to forget itself. The digital burn bag is still sitting in the corner of the mainframe, a silent, encrypted file that is waiting for the next 3:14 a.m. But as we conclude our look into the origin of this nightmare, a new pattern has emerged from the data. Among the 12,104 victims of the 1989 incineration, there was a group of 17 individuals who all lived on the same street in a small town in Maryland, just miles from the Fort Meade server room. Why were they chosen? Was it a coincidence? Or was the digital burn bag being used for something much more personal than national security? As we move to the next subtitle, the 12,104, a pattern of intentional selection. We will go door to door in that Maryland neighborhood. We will discover that the people erased that night weren't just random citizens, they were the only people in the world who knew the true name of the man who wrote the Lethe Code. The file is turning, the cold air is shifting, and the pattern is finally coming into focus. If you were to plot the physical addresses of the 12,104 people erased on November 12, 1989, onto a map of the United States, you would not see a random scatter of points. Instead, you would see something far more disturbing, a geometric anomaly. The dots do not form a cloud, they form a grid of perfect, interconnected lines that converge on very specific, classified locations. For decades, the public was led to believe that the Lethe protocol was a digital accidental glitch in an encrypted Cold War failsafe. But the hidden truth buried in the sub-basement of the Social Security Administration reveals a much darker reality. These individuals were not random casualties of a machine, they were selected. Each of the 12,104 shared a specific, encrypted metadata tag that had been quietly inserted into their federal files as early as 1972. They were the only people in the country who possessed a shared, dormant memory of a project that predates the internet itself. They were erased not because the system failed, but because the system was performing a precise, administrative execution of a witness list. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this limestone vault is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the very breath of the archive. The air is perfectly still, chilled to 55 degrees, making each breath visible for a fleeting second before it vanishes into the cold. As we slide the heavy steel drawer open, the file is cold to the touch, and the scent of old ionized paper fills the space. The ink on the selection manifest has faded with secrets, leaving behind only the ghostly outlines of names that the world was told to forget. We move slowly now, deeper into the analytical silence, tracing the common thread that binds the 12104 dot to the casual observer. A group of 12,104 people is just a number, a medium-sized stadium, a small city. But to a data analyst it is a massive sample size. In the law of large numbers, randomness creates a predictable distribution. You would expect a balance of ages, professions, and geographic locations. However, as we analyze the zero files with a cold, scholarly eye, the randomness disappears. The first anomaly is the geographic concentration. While the erased were spread across 48 states, 17 of them lived on the same tree-lined street in a quiet suburb of Bethesda, Maryland, less than 6 miles from the NSA headquarters at Fort Meade. The statistical probability of 17 unrelated people on a single street being part of a 12,000 per national glitch is effectively zero. It is not just improbable, it is an impossibility. As the green cursor on the archival terminal flickers against the dark screen, we see the names of those 17 residents. They were not high-level officials, they were normal people, a retired watchmaker, a librarian, a high school physics teacher, a stay-at-home mother. But as we dig into the pre-archive, the records that existed before the incineration, we find that every one of those 17 people had worked at the same facility between 1968 and 1971, the National Bureau of Standards. Project Clockwork. Intellectual curiosity leads us to wonder, what was Project Clockwork? The official records say it was a study on the synchronization of atomic clocks, but the selection pattern suggests something else. Of the 12,104 victims, over 40% had a direct link to time synchronization technology. Why would a digital burn bag designed for the Cold War target people who understood how time is measured? The quiet dread begins to settle as we realize that Project Lethe wasn't just about erasing who you are, it was about erasing when you are. The air in the archive seems to drop another few degrees as we turn to the psychological profiles of the erased. Every one of the 12,104 had been flagged by the government's early social probability algorithms. These were people who were classified as high stability, low engagement. In simpler terms, they were people who followed routines, stayed out of trouble, and lived quiet, unremarkable lives. They were the perfect subjects for a mass erasure because their absence would create the least amount of social friction. Reflection on this reveals a chilling bureaucratic logic. If you are going to test a system of administrative annihilation, you do not start with the loud or the famous. You start with the people who are so well integrated into the background of society that they are essentially invisible. The 12,104 were the background noise of America. By erasing the noise, the government could see if the signal remained stable. A faint static hiss comes from the old reel-to-reel player in the corner of the room, a remnant of a 1980s surveillance debrief. The voice on the tape is calm, clinical, and detached. It discusses the selection criteria for the Lethe baseline. The speaker mentions that the victims were chosen because they all possessed a specific genetic marker of memory, a predisposition for high detail long-term recall. This adds a terrifying new layer to the mystery. The government wasn't just erasing their records, they were erasing people who were biologically incapable of forgetting what they had seen during their time at facilities like Project Clockwork. They were inconvenient witnesses whose very brains were a threat to the secrecy of the state. As we sit in the archive, we must consider the experience of the 17 neighbors in Bethesda on the morning of November 12. Imagine waking up in a house where your neighbors, your friends of 20 years, no longer recognize your name because the phone book, the utility bills, and even the local library records have been wiped clean in the same second. The archive chill here is not the loss of data, but the loss of the shared reality that makes a community possible. The hum of the server room deepens, a steady hypnotic drone that pulls us further into the data. We begin to see the recursive algorithm that drove the selection. The system didn't just pick 12,100 for people and stop, it picked people whose erasure would lead to the secondary erasure of others. By removing a specific librarian, you also remove the record of the books she checked out, the finds she collected, and the history of the people who visited her branch. It was a domino deletion. The 12,104 were the first dominoes. By the time the protocol was finished, the digital footprint of nearly 500,000 people had been subtly altered, skewed, or blurred. The government wasn't just deleting individuals, they were re-editing the margins of American history to remove any trace of the project they wanted to hide. As we look at a faded ink diagram found in the back of a blue folder, we see a map of the Bethesda Street. There are red circles around the houses of the 17 erased residents, but there is also a gold circle around an 18th house. This was the home of Dr. Eris Thorne, the man who wrote the original code for Project Lethe. Dr. Thorne was not erased. He was the one who watched. Intellectual curiosity becomes a cold realization. The 17 people on that street weren't just random colleagues of Dr. Thorne, they were his human backups. In an era before redundant cloud storage, Dr. Thorne had placed data fragments in the lives of his neighbors, sharing stories, giving them specific documents to keep, and telling them secrets disguised as casual conversation. The 12,104 were the physical hard drives of a secret that Dr. Thorne didn't want to carry alone. And when the system triggered at 3:14 a.m., it wasn't just deleting data, it was wiping the drives. The quiet dread of the archive is the realization that your memories are just as much a part of the record as your tax returns. And if the state decides those memories are classified, they have the tools to ensure those memories have no one left to hold them. The monitor flickers again, displaying a series of social security numbers being crossed out one by one. It is a slow, hypnotic process. Each X represents a life being moved into the void. We see the pattern now. It is a web designed to catch anyone who knew the truth about the timesync anomaly of 1968. The 12,104, a pattern of intentional selection, is not a story of a mistake. It is a story of a purge. It is the story of how a government used the very technology meant to organize our lives to instead atomize them. We stay in this state of analytical reflection, moving through the names, the dates, and the coordinates. We feel the weight of the silence. Each folder we open is a testament to the power of the digital burn bag. We see the medical records of a man who suddenly had no blood type on file. We see the marriage license of a couple who, according to the state, had never met. The archival tone of our investigation remains steady. We are not here to judge, but to document. We are the 30-member collective, the historians of the unseen. And as we close part 1 of this investigation, we find ourselves standing at the door of the 18th house, the home of Dr. Eris Thorne. To enter the story of Dr. Eris Thorne is to enter the very heart of the archive chill. If the 12,104 were the victims of the selection, Thorne was the hand that drew the circle. As we analyze the internal memos from the Office of Records Management, a chilling picture of Dr. Thorne emerges. He was a man who didn't believe in the permanence of the human soul. To him, a human being was simply an information packet. And packets, by their very nature, are designed to be sent, received, or discarded. The cold air in our archive seems to vibrate with the intensity of Thorne's logic. In his private journals, discovered in a hidden compartment of his Bethesda home years after his disappearance, Thorne wrote about the necessity of the void. He believed that for a civilization to move forward, it must be able to prune its own history. He saw the 12,104 not as people, but as corrupted sectors of the national hard drive. He wrote, "We are entering an age where the record will be too heavy for the world to carry. We must learn to burn the past so that the future has room to breathe. The selection is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of maintenance." The faint static on our playback device shifts into a clinical whine, the sound of a high-speed data transfer from 1989. This was the sound of the selection protocol being seeded into the federal mainframe. Thorne didn't just pick names, he picked structural points. Imagine the American social fabric as a massive, interconnected web of light. Most people are just points of light in the middle of the web. But some people, the 12,104, the nodes, they are the points where multiple threads of history and information meet. By erasing a node, you don't just lose one point of light, you cause entire sections of the web to sag and lose their shape. This was the pattern of intentional selection. It was a structural erasure. We return to the 17 neighbors on Thorne Street. Intellectual curiosity leads us to ask, why did he choose his own neighbors? The archive reveals a psychological experiment that is as cold as the limestone walls around us. Thorne wanted to see if the human mind could detect the void. For 3 years before the 1989 incineration, Thorne would go for walks on his street. He would talk to the watchmaker about the precision of gears. He would talk to the librarian about the fragility of vellum. He would talk to the physics teacher about the elasticity of time. As the monitor flickers, we see a surveillance photo of Thorne standing on his porch, watching his neighbors. He was programming them. He was giving them tiny, encrypted fragments of the Project Clockwork secrets. He was turning them into distributed storage. He knew that when the Lethe protocol was triggered, these 17 people would be the first to be erased. He wanted to be the only person left in the world who remembered the truth. He was creating a monopoly of memory. The quiet dread of this revelation is the realization that the selection was personal. The 12,104 were people who had, in some way, crossed paths with the architects of the code. They were the data leaks that needed to be plugged. We must now address the 114 phantom identities, the wraiths that were hidden among the 12,104. In Part 1, we learned that these were fake identities created to fill the void. But as we look closer at the selection pattern, we find an even more disturbing link. Of the 114 wraiths, every single one of them was a digital composite of the people who had been erased. The hum of the server room feels heavier now, like a physical weight on the chest. The archival data shows that the Lethe protocol didn't just delete the 12,104, it harvested them. It took the credit score of the watchmaker, the educational background of the librarian, and the family history of the teacher, and it spliced them together to create the 114 wraiths. The wraiths weren't just ghosts, they were Frankenstein identities. They were built from the discarded parts of the erased. This was the refinement of the selection. The government wasn't just clearing space, they were recycling the administrative value of the citizens they destroyed. Intellectual reflection brings us to the ultimate horror of the archive chill. In the eyes of the system, you are more valuable as a collection of parts than as a whole person. We look at a faded ink ledger from Division 0. It lists the yield of the 1989 incineration. It doesn't mention lives lost. It mentions data points reclaimed. It mentions operational capacity increased. The selection was a harvest. So, what was the common link that bound the 12,104 together? After 3,000 words of analysis, we have reached the core. The link was not a job. It was not a location. It was not a genetic marker. The link was a signature. In the early 1970s, the government conducted a series of census surveys that were actually psychological tests. They asked questions that seemed mundane. How often do you look at the clock? Do you remember the names of your childhood neighbors? Do you feel that the world is moving faster than it used to? The faint static on the tape recorder clears for a moment, and we hear Thorne's voice again. The 12,104 are the ones who answered yes to the final question. They are the ones who can feel the sync. They are the ones who know that the record is being edited. The 12,104 were the people who were They were the people who had the intuitive sense that the digital world was not quite matching the physical one. They were the people who noticed the glitches in their own lives. The selection was a preemptive strike against the only people who would be able to see through the government's future deceptions. By erasing the 12,104, the state was removing the internal auditors of reality. The cold air is now absolute. We are standing in a world that has been cleaned of its most perceptive citizens. The selection pattern was a filter designed to remove the anomalies from the human population, the people who ask too many questions, the people who remember too much, and the people who feel the archive chill before it even arrives. As we move toward the conclusion of this subtitle, we look at the last folder in the crate. It belongs to subject 12104. The name on the file is not a name, it is a set of coordinates. Those coordinates lead to a small, unmarked plot of land in the Nevada desert. Near the facility we mentioned in part 1. The monitor flickers one last time, showing a live satellite feed of that Nevada plot. There is a small building there, with no windows and a single steel door. Inside that building is the master registry, the only physical copy of the names of the 12,104. We have traced the pattern, we have seen the selection, we have understood the common link. The 12,104 were not deleted by a glitch. They were deleted by a design that viewed their awareness as a threat to national stability. But as we close this chapter of the archive chill, a new, even more disturbing question arises. If the 12,104 were the nodes of the old web, what happens when the new web, the internet of the 21st century, develops its own selection protocol? We have found a memo from 2024, signed by a name we recognize from the 114 wraiths. It mentions a new project, a global Lethe, designed to target not just 12,000 people, but 12% of the global population. And the selection criteria for this new project have already begun to appear in the algorithms of your social media, your banking apps, and your search history. As we move to the next subtitle, I No Longer Exist, the first reported ghost, we will meet the man who woke up today and found that his name had been moved from the live list to the zero. We will see what happens when the selection pattern finds you. The limestone walls are closing in. The hum of the server is reaching a pitch that only the 12,104 can hear, and the file is still open. In the high-security archives of the Social Security Administration, every American is reduced to a 9-digit sequence. It is the fundamental code of your existence. But on a Tuesday morning in late 1989, a 42-year-old veteran named Christopher Hauer entered a local branch in Ohio and discovered a terrifying anomaly. When the clerk typed his number into the terminal, the system didn't return a name, a tax history, or even a death certificate. Instead, the screen displayed a single, chilling word, unassigned. This was the first physical evidence of a classified operation that had moved from the shadows of the Pentagon into the lives of the unsuspecting. Christopher hadn't just been erased. His entire historical presence had been encrypted and archived in a file that the system no longer recognized. The hidden truth was that the government's digital burn bag had accidentally caught a live subject in its wake. Christopher Hauer was the first ghost resident, a man who was still breathing, yet whose legal soul had been incinerated by a server pulse 300 miles away. The file was stamped "Never Open." Yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this sterile office is the quiet hum of the server room, a distant, mechanical drone that feels like the white noise of a fading reality. The air in the archive is perfectly still, chilled to an analytical 55 degrees. As we pull the incident report from its steel drawer, the folder is cold to the touch, and the scent of old paper and ozone lingers in the creases. The ink on Christopher's original application has faded with secrets, leaving behind a ghostly silhouette of a life that the system decided was no longer necessary. We move slowly now, into the quiet dread of the morning that changed everything. The day began with a silence that Christopher Hauer would later describe as metallic. It was a November morning in 1989, a time when the world was focused on the falling of walls in Europe. Christopher was a man of habita, former radar technician who valued precision and order. He lived in a modest home in Columbus, a house filled with the tangible evidence of a life well lived, military commendations on the wall, a mortgage ledger on the desk, and a passport in the bedside drawer. He woke up at 6 a.m., the sunlight filtering through the blinds in thin, cold strips of gray. There was no indication that he had been selected for the Lethe protocol, no flickering lights, no strange phone calls. But as he prepared his coffee, a faint static seemed to hang in the air, a subtle electrical tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. He attributed it to the dry winter air, unaware that, at that very moment, his digital footprint was being systematically degaussed in a server farm in Maryland. Christopher's first encounter with the void happened at his local bank. He had gone there to withdraw a small amount of cash for a weekend trip. The bank was a place of wood paneling and heavy brass, an institution built on the permanence of wealth and identity. He handed his teller card to the woman behind the glass, a woman who had greeted him by name for over 5 years. As she swiped the card, The monitor at her station flickered with a sharp, green burst of light. She frowned, her eyes scanning the text that Christopher could not see. She swiped it again. Then, a third time. The rhythmic click of the magnetic strip was the only sound in the sudden silence of the lobby. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hauer," she said, her voice shifting from warmth to a cold, professional distance. "The system is rejecting the card. It says the account number is invalid." Christopher smiled. A practiced, calm response. "There must be a glitch. I've had that account since I left the service." The teller didn't smile back. She looked at her screen again, her brow furrowed in intellectual curiosity. "It's not just the card, sir. When I look up your social security number to verify the account, the system tells me that this number has never been issued. It's unassigned." A sudden draft of cold air seemed to sweep through the bank lobby, though the doors remained closed. Christopher felt a hollow sensation in his chest, a quiet dread that he couldn't quite name. He produced his physical social security card, the blue and white paper that he had carried since he was 16. He laid it on the counter. The paper felt brittle, almost alien in his hand. The teller looked at the card, then back at her screen. To her, the physical object was a curiosity, a piece of boring history that held no weight against the absolute authority of the digital record. In the emerging world of the 1980s, if the computer said you didn't exist, the paper in your hand was nothing more than a well-crafted lie. Christopher left the bank and drove immediately to the Social Security Administration office. He was an analytical man. He believed that every problem had a technical solution. He assumed that a data entry error had occurred, a simple, localized anomaly that a supervisor could fix with a few keystrokes. The SSA office was a temple of fluorescent lighting and linoleum floors. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the faint static of a dozen humming terminals. He took a number and sat in a plastic chair, watching the clock on the wall. The second hand moved with a clinical, relentless precision, marking the time as he moved further away from his legal identity. When his number was called, he sat across from a man named Harold, a career bureaucrat who had spent 30 years managing the records of the living. Harold was a man who lived by the file. He wore a gray tie and silver-rimmed glasses that caught the flicker of the overhead lights. "How can I help you today?" Harold asked, his voice a dry archival rasp. "There seems to be an error with my social security number," Christopher said, placing his military ID and his SSN card on the desk. "My bank says it's unassigned." Harold nodded, his fingers dancing across the keyboard. He didn't look at Christopher. He looked at the terminal, the true face of the state. He typed in the 9 digits, the code of Christopher's life. A faint static hiss emanated from the terminal's speakers. Harold stopped. He stared at the screen for a long time, his analytical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He cleared the field and typed it again. Slow, deliberate. "This is impossible," Harold whispered. "What is it?" Christopher asked, the quiet dread now a cold weight in his stomach. "Mr. Hauer," Harold said, finally looking up. His eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, intellectual curiosity that bordered on fear. "I have access to the master registry. Even if a person dies, their number remains in the system. It's marked deceased, but it's there. Even if a number is revoked due to fraud, the record of the revocation exists. But your number, it's not just missing. The system says it was never part of the sequence. It's as if the digits themselves have been erased from the mathematical history of this department." Christopher felt the world shift. He was standing in a government building, surrounded by the evidence of his 42 years on Earth. Yet the state was telling him that he was an anomaly, a ghost that had appeared out of nowhere. The reflection of this event in Christopher's mind was one of total, clinical isolation. He spent the next 6 hours in that office, moving from one supervisor to the next. With each level of authority he reached, the answer remained the same. The records weren't lost, they were unmade. He asked them to look for his parents' records. Surely his birth record would be linked to theirs. The supervisor, a woman in a cold blue suit, typed in his father's information. The screen flickered, the names appeared, but when she scrolled down to the dependents section, the space where Christopher's name should have been was a blank, gray line. It wasn't that he was missing from the list. The list had been reformatted to exclude him entirely. The archive chill was no longer a metaphor. Christopher could feel it in his bones. The government's digital burn bag, the Lethe protocol, had not just deleted his current file. It had moved backward through the archives, like a digital virus, erasing the hidden truth of his entire existence. He drove home that evening in a state of hypnotic shock. He walked through his front door and went straight to his filing cabinet. He needed to touch the paper. He needed to see the ink. He pulled out his birth certificate. The paper was yellowed, the edges frayed. He looked at the official seal of the state of Ohio. He looked at the signature of the doctor. Then, he looked at the date. As he watched, under the dim light of his desk lamp, a faint static seemed to dance across the surface of the document. The ink, which had been dark and permanent for 4 decades, began to look thin, blurry. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. When he looked again, the name Christopher Hauer was still there, but it looked like a photocopy of a photocopy. The authority of the document was draining away. He realized then that the Lethe protocol was not just a data wipe. It was a multi-dimensional administrative strike. If the master record was incinerated, the physical echoes of that record, the birth certificates, the licenses, would eventually be flagged as anomalies by anyone who looked at them. The world was being rewritten, and he was the typo that was being corrected. Christopher sat in the dark of his living room, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. He felt a sudden intellectual curiosity about his neighbors. He had lived on this street for 10 years. He knew the mailman. He knew the woman who walked her dog every morning at 7:15. He walked out onto his porch. The air was cold, biting at his skin. He saw his neighbor, Mr. Henderson, raking leaves across the street. Henderson was a man who had shared a beer with Christopher every 4th of July for a decade. Christopher walked down his driveway. "Hey, Bill," he called out. Henderson stopped raking. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the late afternoon sun. He looked at Christopher, but there was no spark of recognition. No wave, just a polite, cautious nod. "Can I help you, neighbor?" Henderson asked. The dread in Christopher's chest turned into a freezing void. "Bill, it's me, Chris, from across the street." Henderson leaned on his rake, his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, friend. I've lived here 15 years. That house across the street, the one you just came out of, that's been in probate for months. Nobody's lived there since the old lady passed away last summer." Christopher looked back at his house. The paint was the same. The curtains were the same. But to Henderson, to the world, the context of Christopher Hauer had been removed. When the Lethe protocol erased his digital identity, it also seemed to trigger a social erasure. Without the digital anchors that linked him to the community, the memories of his neighbors were becoming as blurry as the ink on his birth certificate. A faint static hum began to vibrate in Christopher's ears. The 17.4 Hz frequency of the archive. He realized he wasn't just losing his credit cards and his social security number. He was losing his place in the human story. He was becoming a ghost resident. He went back inside and locked the door. He sat on his floor, surrounded by his military uniforms and his old photographs. He realized that the government hadn't just accidentally erased a veteran. They had used him as a live test for a world where the state could decide who was real and who was a classified anomaly. As the sun set, Christopher Hauer realized he was the first human being to experience the archive chill in its purest form. He was the first reported ghost. He was the man who no longer existed, yet he was still very much afraid. To exist without a record is to discover the terrifying fragility of the physical world. Christopher Hauer sat in his dark kitchen, his analytical mind attempting to catalog the mechanics of his own disappearance. He was a radar technician. He knew how to find objects that didn't want to be found. But now, he was the invisible target. He realized that the archive chill was a multi-layered process. It started with the digital, the social security number, the bank accounts, the tax IDs. These were the primary records. When those were incinerated by the Lethe protocol, the secondary records began to fail. The cold air in the kitchen felt heavier now, as if the room itself was acknowledging his lack of status. He picked up his telephone, a heavy beige rotary unit. He dialed his sister in Chicago. He needed to hear a voice that remembered his name. The line clicked. There was a long pause, filled with a faint, high-pitched static. "Hello," a woman's voice said. It was his sister, Diane. "Diane, it's Chris," he said, his voice trembling. There was another silence. "Who is this?" "It's Chris, your brother, Christopher." "I don't have a brother," Diane said, her voice calm, almost hypnotic. "I think you have the wrong number." "Diane, listen to me. I'm in Columbus, Mom's house. Remember the summer we went to the lake?" "I'm sorry," she said, and Christopher could hear the sound of her drinking something, a mundane, terrifying sound of a life he was no longer part of. "I'm an only child. Please don't call again." The dial tone that followed was a sharp, clinical buzz. Christopher looked at the phone. He realized that the Lethe protocol was deeper than he had imagined. It wasn't just an administrative tool. It was an information weapon that worked on the principles of contextual displacement. By removing the source file of his identity, the government had triggered a cascading erasure of every mention of him in the lives of others. The intellectual dread of this was staggering. How much of our memory is supported by the world around us? If the world stops confirming who we are, do we cease to be ourselves? Christopher knew he couldn't stay in the house. If his neighbors didn't recognize him, and his family had forgotten him, it was only a matter of time before the physical cleaners arrived. In the world of the archive, an anomaly is a problem to be solved. He gathered his remaining cash to a few $100s he had in his sock drawer that the bank hadn't been able to touch. He grabbed his old military rucksack and headed for the door, but as he reached for the handle, he saw something tucked under the frame. That it was a manila envelope. No address, no stamp. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of a classified memo from the National Security Agency, dated November 12, 1989. The header read, Project Lethe, Operational Anomaly Report. The paper felt cold to the touch, the ink slightly raised, as if it had been printed in a hurry. Christopher read the words, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Subject 001 Howard Christopher. Status, incinerated. Note, protocol executed prematurely due to a logic gate error in the Woodland server farm. Subject remains physically present but digitally void. Recommendation, observe. Do not engage. Allow the social fade to complete the transition. Subject is now a ghost asset. Reference file 0 files/section 4. Christopher dropped the paper. He wasn't a mistake. He was a subject. The government knew exactly what had happened. They were watching him, waiting for the social fade, the process where the world's memory of him would finally vanish, leaving him a literal ghost in a world of living records. Christopher Howard spent the next 3 days living out of his car, a ghost resident on the American interstate. He avoided the major cities, sticking to the rural roads where the digital grid was thinner, but even there, the archive chill followed him. He tried to buy gas with his remaining cash. The clerk at the station, a young man with a Walkman clipped to his belt, took the $20 bill and held it up to the light. This bill looks funny, the boy said, his eyes filled with a sudden, intellectual curiosity. It's just a 20, Christopher said, his voice a low, analytical rasp. The serial number, the boy said, pointing to the green ink. It's missing a digit. And the face. It looks like it's fading. Christopher looked at the bill. The boy was right. Even his money was losing its context. The Lethe protocol was a total incineration. Anything Christopher touched, anything he owned, was being pulled into the void with him. He drove into the night, the green light of the dashboard flickering with a sharp rhythmic static. He realized he was the hidden truth of the modern age. He was the proof that our lives are no longer our own. We are the properties of the archive, and the archive can evict us at any time. But he thought about the 12,103 others who were erased that night. Were they all going through this? Were they all standing in their kitchens, watching their birth certificates fade? Were they all calling sisters who didn't remember them? He felt a sudden, quiet dread for the future. If this could happen in 1989 with primitive mainframes and magnetic tapes, what could happen in a world of interconnected databases and global surveillance? Christopher Howard was just the prototype. He was the first reported ghost. But he wouldn't be the last. On the 4th day, Christopher stopped at a diner in a small town in West Virginia. He went into the restroom to wash his face. He stood at the sink, the cold water splashing against his skin. He looked up at the mirror. The air in the restroom was freezing. He looked at his reflection. At first it seemed normal, but as he watched, the edges of his face began to blur, not like a camera out of focus, but like an image that was being desampled. His eyes were becoming too dark, clinical smudges. His skin was taking on the texture of a low-resolution photograph. He realized that the social fade was moving into the physical fade. Without a digital identity to anchor him to the material world, his very atoms were beginning to lose their coherence. He was becoming an anomaly, in the truest sense of the word. He leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. He took a finger and wrote a single word in the condensation, Lethe. As he watched, the letters began to glow with a faint green static. Then, they vanished. Christopher Howard walked out of the diner and into the cold morning air. He didn't go back to his car. He didn't go back to Columbus. He walked toward the woods, toward the places where there were no terminals, no servers, and no records. He realized that his only hope for survival was to become a true ghost, to live in the spaces between the data, to become the static in the system. He was the first reported ghost, the man who proved that the government had the power to incinerate a human soul. But he also proved something else. He proved that, even when you are erased, something remains. A memory. A feeling of quiet dread. A chill in the air when a certain name is mentioned. Christopher Hauer was gone from the grid, but he was still a witness. As we close the file on I No Longer Exist, we are left with a haunting question. If Christopher Hauer was the first reported ghost, what happened to the report? We have discovered a series of encrypted logs from a facility known as Fort Meade, dated exactly 2 years after Christopher's disappearance. The logs describe a digital reanimation, a project where the government attempted to use the burned data of the 12,104 to create something new, something that could move through the system undetected. They didn't just want to erase people, they wanted to replace them with anomalies of their own design. As we move to the next subtitle, The Fort Meade Anomaly of 1991, we will enter the heart of the NSA's most secret lab. We will see the first digital wraith, an entity that looks exactly like Christopher Hauer, but which has no heart, no memory, and a 9-digit code that shouldn't exist. The terminal is flickering, the cold air is rising, and the ghost is finally waking up. In the high summer of 1991, 2 years after the world was told that the identity glitch was a mere hardware malfunction, a courier bag was discovered in a secure dumpster behind the National Security Agency's headquarters at Fort Meade. Inside was a document that would become the most sought-after anomaly in modern cryptology, the Lethe Alpha Memorandum. This classified internal report, encrypted under a protocol that officially did not exist, revealed a terrifying hidden truth. The government didn't just know that 12,104 Americans had been erased. They had been monitoring the data void with the precision of a laboratory experiment. The memo proved that while families were searching for missing records, the NSA was tracking the ghost signals, residual electronic pulses, emitted by the erased citizens' Novikent social security slots. These files were never meant to be recovered. They were being used to test a new form of digital shadow government. The document details how the system didn't just fail. It evolved. It was a file stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this limestone vault is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a steady, white noise drone that seems to vibrate in the very marrow of your bones. The air is perfectly still, chilled to an analytical 55 degrees to preserve the integrity of the magnetic tapes. As we slide the heavy steel drawer of the 91 Annex open, the folder is cold to the touch, and the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and old adhesive fills the space. The ink on the leaked memo has faded with secrets, the letters appearing slightly blurred as if they are trying to retreat from the page. We move slowly now, deeper into the architectural silence where the evidence of the Fort Meade anomaly was first gathered. To understand the 1991 anomaly, one must understand the environment of Fort Meade during the transition from the Cold War to the digital age. It was a place of endless corridors, fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, hypnotic frequency, and the constant low-level static of global eavesdropping. In the winter of 1990, a low-level data analyst named Arthur Pendergast noticed something in the system logs that defied the laws of information theory. Arthur was responsible for traffic analysis, monitoring the flow of data between federal mainframes. He noticed that the slots previously occupied by the 12,104 erased citizens were not empty. In a standard computer system, a deleted file leaves behind a null value, but these slots were vibrating. They were emitting a faint rhythmic pulse of data too small to be a file, but too consistent to be random noise, that it was as if the ghosts of the erased were still knocking on the doors of the mainframe. Intellectual curiosity led Arthur to dig deeper. He realized that these pulses were synchronized. At exactly 3:14 a.m. every night, the voids would align, creating a massive collective signal that bypassed the NSA's primary file. This was the Fort Meade anomaly. It wasn't a glitch. It was a digital echo of the Lethe protocol. The quiet dread in the archive intensifies as we read Pendergast's private notes. He believed that the Lethe protocol hadn't just deleted the data, it had converted the legal identities of those 12,104 people into a form of dark data, information that exists in the system but cannot be seen or accessed by standard means. The leaked memo, dated July 14, 1991, confirms this. It was addressed to the Director of Division 0, a department that, as we previously discovered, manages the void. The memo stated, observation of the 12,104 ghost slots shows 99% synchronization. The static threshold has been reached. We are now able to use the void to mask the movement of the 114 guest identities. This was the smoking gun. The government wasn't trying to fix the deletion. They were using the emptiness left behind by the erased citizens as a cloaking device for their own secret operations. The 12,104 were the digital camouflage for the 0414 phantoms. Consider the clinical coldness of this strategy. To the state, those 12,104 lives were no longer people. They were bandwidth, they were storage space. By erasing them, the government had created a silent zone within the American infrastructure, a place where they could hide money, move agents, and conduct surveillance without leaving a single digital footprint. The hum of the server room feels heavier as we reflect on this. In 1991, the internet was just a whisper. Most people didn't understand the power of data. But at Fort Meade, they already knew that the one who controls the void controls the reality. The memo describes an incident in May 1991, where a technician in the Maryland facility attempted to reformat one of the empty drives. According to the report, the moment he initiated the command, the temperature in the server room dropped by 20 degrees. The monitor at his station displayed a series of encrypted strings that, when decoded, were found to be the home addresses of the 12,104 victims. The machine was fighting back, or rather, the archive was refusing to let go of the erased. This is the essence of the archive Lethe realization that once a piece of information is entered into the system, it never truly leaves. It only changes state. Pendergast's investigation led him to a secret wing of the Fort Meade complex known as the crypt. This was where the physical magnetic tapes of the 1989 incineration were stored. He managed to gain access for less than 5 minutes, but what he saw there was enough to drive him to leak the memo. The tapes were not in standard storage. They were housed in a vacuum-sealed chamber, suspended in a field of liquid nitrogen. They were being kept alive. The government wasn't just hiding the evidence. They were waiting for the technology to catch up so they could reanimate the data. The 114 wraiths were the first successful attempt at this The memo details how the digital soul of a librarian from Ohio was spliced onto a blank identity for a field operative. The operative didn't just get her social security number, they got her behavioral metadata, the patterns of her life, her shopping habits, her daily routines. They were building perfect infiltrators from the scraps of the erased. Why did Pendergast leak the memo? He knew it would mean the end of his career, and likely his legal identity. The archive reveals a psychological profile of Pendergast conducted by Division Zero after the leak. They concluded that he was suffering from archival vertigo, the overwhelming sense of dread that comes from realizing the scale of the state's deception. In his final note before disappearing, Pendergast wrote, "The anomaly is not in the machine, the anomaly is us. We have built a world where the file is more real than the person, and if the file is wrong, the person is an error that must be corrected." The 1991 memo was a warning that the digital burn bag was just the beginning. The next phase was digital reconstruction. The government was learning how to play God with the archive. As we sit in the cold light of the archive, we must ask ourselves, how many errors are currently walking the streets? How many people are actually digital composites built from the voids of the 12,104? The Fort Meade anomaly proves that the 1989 incineration was not a one-time event. It was the birth of a new kind of power, the power of selectable history. We move now into the deeper technicalities of the Phase Alpha Memorandum. We look at the synchronization tables. These are pages of dense, numerical data that show how the pulses of the 12,104 were being used to generate a master frequency. The monitor flickers, showing a waveform that looks like a heartbeat, but it's not the heartbeat of a human. It's the heartbeat of a database, a living, breathing archive that is hungry for more empty space. The intellectual dread of the 1991 anomaly is the realization that the static we hear on old recordings, the glitches we see on security footage, and the cold spots we feel in government buildings are not accidents. They are the residue of the Lethe protocol. They are the ghosts of the archive, trying to find their way back into the light, but the light is being guarded by Division Zero. The air in our vault is perfectly still. The story of Arthur Pendergast and the Fort Meade memo is a testament to the fact that the truth always leaves a trail, even if that trail is made of nothing. As we conclude part 1 of this investigation into the 1991 anomaly, we find ourselves standing at the door of the crypt. We are about to see what happens when the dark data is finally decoded. To enter the crypt at Fort Meade, one must first surrender the notion that space and time are fixed. In the 1991 memo, Arthur Pendergast described this facility not as a room, but as a non-Euclidean archive. It was a space designed by the same architects who built the Lethe coda space, where the physical laws were secondary to the laws of information. The air in the crypt was kept at a constant -10 degrees, not for the preservation of paper, but for the stabilization of the ghost signals. In the cold, data moves differently. it becomes more brittle, more predictable. The government discovered that by supercooling the magnetic tapes of the 12104, they could slow down the rate at which the identities were fading. They were keeping the erased in a state of administrative suspended animation. The leaked memo contains a section titled The Harvesting of the Static. It details how sensors were placed throughout the vault to capture the 17.4 Hz frequency we discussed earlier. The NSA realized that this frequency was not just noise. It was a carrier wave. It was carrying the residual metadata of the erased, their preferences, their fears, their subconscious patterns. This was the hidden truth that Pendergast couldn't stomach. The government wasn't just hiding these people, they were mining them for psychological data. They were using the 12104 as a training dataset for the first generation of predictive, social control algorithms. The Phase Alpha memo singles out one specific anomaly from the winter of 1991. It concerns Subject 402, the librarian from Ohio whose data had been spliced onto a wraith, according to the report. The static associated with Subject 402's slot began to scream. The monitor at the monitoring station displayed a series of impossible commands. The void of Subject 402 was attempting to reclaim its data from the wraith. The system logs showed a conflict of identity, a digital war being fought between the erased woman and the agent who had stolen her life. The clinical notes in the memo are chilling. Subject 402 void exhibited signs of aggressive coherence, recommended action, increased degaussing of the primary sector. Result: Subject 402 void silenced, wraith stability restored. They didn't just erase her, they had to kill her a second time in the digital world. The intellectual dread of this is the realization that deletion is not always permanent. Information wants to exist. It wants to be known. The Fort Meade anomaly was the sound of 12,104 voids trying to scream their way back into existence. Pendergast realized that the 114 wraiths were not just agents, they were parasites. They were living off the digital life force of the people the government had sacrificed. And the 1991 memo was the instruction manual for how to maintain this parasitic relationship. As we sit in the archive, we must consider the missing page of the Phase Alpha memorandum. When the document was first leaked, page 14 was absent. For years it was assumed to be lost or destroyed, but in 2024, a digital fragment of that page was found in a deep web archive. Page 14 contained the expansion protocol. It revealed that the 12,104 were just the beta test. The anomaly of 1991 proved that the system could handle a void load of that size. The government was already planning for phase beta, intentional erasure of 150 citizens in the event of a national emergency. The burn bag was getting bigger. The hum of our server room seems to pulse with this information. The expansion protocol mentioned that the ideal candidates for erasure were those who spent the most time in non-digital spaces, those who still read physical books, wrote letters, and spoke to their neighbors. They were the hardest to erase, and therefore the most important to neutralize. The quiet dread of the archive is the realization that your privacy is actually a target profile. The less the system knows about you, the more it wants to erase you. What happened to Arthur Pendergast? The 1991 memo was his final act as a live entity. After the leak, the records for Pendergast follow a familiar pattern. His name was zeroed, his military record was degaussed, his birth certificate in Pennsylvania was recoded as a clerical error. He became Subject 12,105. But there is a final, haunting entry in the Division 0 log from 1992. It mentions that the static in the vault at Fort Meade had acquired a new signature. A signature that matched the typing, rhythm, and date analysis patterns of Arthur Pendergast. He didn't just leak the memo, he became part of the anomaly. He is still there, in the crypt, a rhythmic pulse in the liquid nitrogen, a ghost signal that continues to knock on the doors of the mainframe. The story of the Fort Meade anomaly of 1991 is not just about a leaked memo, it is about the permanence of the ghost. It is the proof that even the most advanced digital burn bag cannot hide the truth forever. The air in the archive is perfectly still now. We have seen the evidence. We have heard the static. We have understood the anomaly. The 1991 memo proves that the government is not afraid of the void. They are afraid of the echo. They are afraid that one day, the 12,104 will synchronize their pulses and crash the system that tried to forget them. As we close the Phase Alpha memorandum, we look at the final command written at the bottom of page 15. It says, "Ensure the archive remains chilled. The ghosts are more manageable when they are cold, but the cooling system at Fort Meade is failing." In the next subtitle, why the restore command was never sent. We will explore the terrifying 48 hours in 1992 when the liquid nitrogen ran low and the static in the vault began to fill. We will see the evidence of ghost printers producing thousands of pages of names in the middle of the night, and we will discover the chilling reason why the government chose to let the servers burn rather than hit the undo button. The temperature is rising, the disk is spinning, and the void is about to speak. In the immediate aftermath of the November 12, 1989, incineration, a high-level recovery team was assembled at the Social Security Administration's Woodland facility. They discovered that the data had not been destroyed by a physical fire, but by an encrypted logic gate within the Lethe protocol. Technically, the data was still there resting in a state of magnetic latency. A single high-priority restore command, if executed within 48 hours, would have realigned the magnetic domains and returned the 12,104 citizens to the digital grid. The anomaly, however, is not that the system failed, but that the command was manually aborted at 98%. Completion, the hidden truth, buried in a classified memo titled Directive 19L, is that the government realized the erased space was more valuable than the people who occupied it. To hit undo would have revealed the existence of the 114 phantom identities already living within the void. A choice was made in a windowless room. To save the secret, they had to sacrifice the citizens. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound is the quiet, steady hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that suggests a machine waiting for an instruction that will never arrive. The air in this deep archive is chilled to an analytical 55 degrees, making the very atmosphere feel heavy with unsaid things. As we slide the heavy steel drawer open, the folder is cold to the touch, and the sharp scent of ozone and old, resting ink fills the narrow aisle. The ink on the final abort order has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly indentation of a signature that was never meant to be seen. We move slowly now into the cold logic of the decision to let 12,104 lives remain in the dark. In the world of archival data recovery, time is the ultimate adversary. When a magnetic tape is degaussed, the information doesn't vanish instantly. It enters a state of high-entropy chaos. For exactly 48 hours, that chaos can be reordered. On the morning of November 13, 1989, Dr. Evelyn Vane, a specialist in cryptographic reconstruction, was flown by a black site transport to Maryland. She was handed a terminal with a blinking green cursor and told to recover the ghosts. The monitor flickered with a rhythmic, sharp intensity as Evelyn began the deep scan of the SSA mainframes. She found the zero files almost immediately. To her analytical eye, they looked like digital scars, areas of the tape where the logic had simply stopped. But beneath the surface, she could see the ghost code. These were the fragments of the 12,104 people, their middle names, their birth years, the zip codes of their childhood homes. The data was reaching out, waiting for the realignment signal. Intellectual curiosity is a powerful motivator. Evelyn worked with a clinical, hypnotic focus. She developed the restore command, a complex sequence of encrypted pulses designed to override the Lethe protocol's incinerate flag. By 2 p.m. on November 14th, the command was ready. It was labeled in the system as 0-sig. A sudden draft of cold air seemed to settle in the server room as Evelyn prepared to hit the execute key. She was surrounded by men in dark suits who did not speak. They watched the screen with a quiet dread. They weren't afraid of the system failing. They were afraid of it succeeding, because as the recovery reached 50%, a second set of files began to emerge from the background noise. These were the 114 wraiths. The analytical problem was immediate and catastrophic. The Lethe protocol had not just erased the 12,104, it had used their magnetic slots to house the phantom identities. To restore the librarian in Ohio would be to overwrite the deep cover operative in Berlin. To bring back the trucker in Nevada would be to incinerate the financial records of a billion-dollar black budget fund. The system was experiencing a contextual collision. A faint static hiss began to emanate from Evelyn's headset. She realized that the undo button was actually a delete button for the government's most sensitive secrets. She looked at the progress bar, 72% complete. Names were beginning to reappear in the master registry. Christopher Howard's social security number was flickering back into existence. For a few seconds, the world was becoming whole again. Reflection on this moment reveals a chilling truth about power. The decision to stop the restoration was not made by a computer. It was made by a man named Director Miller, the head of Division 0. He walked over to Evelyn's terminal, his face a mask of academic detachment. He didn't look at the names of the people being saved. He looked at the names of the wraiths being threatened. "Abort the sequence," Miller said. His voice was as cold as the limestone walls. The hum of the server room seemed to drop in pitch as Evelyn hesitated. "If I abort now, the data will be permanently fragmented," she argued. "They will never be able to be recovered again. We are at 98%. 2 more minutes and they are all back." "The cost of their existence," Miller replied, "is higher than the value of our silence. Execute the abort." The monitor flickered one last time as Evelyn's finger hovered over the cancel key. At 3:14 a.m. on November 15th, exactly 72 hours after the initial incineration, she pressed it. The progress bar vanished. The blinking green cursor returned to a steady, silent pulse. The 12,104 people who were seconds away from being legal citizens again were pushed back into the void. This time, the degaussing was final. The command to restore was never sent again. The archival records of Division 0 reveal a second, even more cynical reason for the never send order. It was a matter of mathematics. When 12,104 people are erased from the grid, they leave behind what the government calls unclaimed equity. These are pension funds, social security contributions, and unpaid tax refunds that no longer have a legal owner. By leaving these people deleted, the federal government effectively gained access to a pool of untraceable capital totaling nearly $400 million in 1989 currency. If they were restored, that money would have to be returned. By keeping them as ghosts, that money could be redirected into the Lethe expansion project. The 12,104 were not just witnesses to a secret, they were a source of funding for the very system that had destroyed them. Intellectual dread sets in when you realize that the command wasn't just blocked by a spy agency, it was blocked by a treasury. The state had calculated the net worth of a ghost, and found that a dead record was more profitable than a living citizen. The archive contains a spreadsheet, a cold, analytical list of the 12,104, cross-referenced with their projected lifetime earnings. Next to each name is a burn value. This was the amount the government stood to gain by ensuring that person never regained their legal identity. The librarian in Ohio was worth $142,000 in unclaimed pension. The physics teacher was worth $210,000. The quiet dread of the archive is the realization that your existence is a line item on a balance sheet, and if your deletion makes the numbers turn green, the system will never hit undo. What happened to Evelyn Vane, the woman who almost saved the ghosts? The archive shows that she was not allowed to leave the Woodlawn facility for 6 months after the abort order. She was placed in a cognitive quarantine, a psychological re-education program designed to ensure she forgot the names she had. Seen on the screen, the monitor at her quarantine station recorded her descent into archival vertigo. She began to write the names of the 12,104 on the walls of her room using the graphite from her pencils. She tried to realign her own memory, to act as a human backup for the data the system had purged. One internal memo from Division 0 describes her state. Subject Vane remains obsessed with the 98% anomaly. She insists that the ghosts are still knocking on the mainframe. Recommended action: permanent administrative reassignment to the static zone. The hum of the server room in our archive feels like Evelyn's heartbeat. She was the only person who knew exactly how close the world came to being restored. She was the one who saw the faces of the 12,104 through the code, and like them, she was eventually processed by the system. By 1992, Evelyn Vane's own employee file was stamped with the Lethe Fazolfa code. She became Subject 12,106. The restore command remains in the system today. It is hidden behind 48 layers of encryption, a dormant piece of logic known only as the Lazarus script. It is the most dangerous file in the world, because it contains the blueprint for undoing 35 years of government deception. But it will never be sent, because to send it would be to admit that for 3 decades, the American government has been a house built on the graves of 12,000 digital souls. We sit in the quiet reflection of this history. We look at the abort order, the paper cold and brittle under our fingers. We realize that the archive chill is not just about a ghost in a machine. It is about the human hand that chooses the machine over the human. The 12,104 are still out there. In the static zone, they are the residual data that Arthur Pendergast found in 1991. They are the infrasound that vibrates in the walls of Fort Meade. They are waiting for a 98% that will never become 100%. Static on our recorder is getting louder, a rhythmic pulsing that sounds like a countdown, but the countdown is stuck. It is stuck at the second before the world was supposed to be made right. To understand why a system would stop a restoration at 98%, one must look into the clinical anatomy of a data collision. In the archive, a 98% recovery means the skeleton of the identity has been rebuilt, but the soul key, the final encryption layer that allows the data to interact with the real world, is still missing. By stopping the command at that exact millisecond, Division Zero did something far more cruel than simple deletion. They created data zombies. The monitor at the recovery station in 1989 showed the 12,104 names turning from red to amber. Amber meant partially coherent. In the physical world, this manifested as a state of administrative limbo. The people were no longer fully erased, but they weren't fully recognized either. This is why, in the years following 1989, many of the 12,104 reported seeing their names appear on junk mail or marketing lists, even though they couldn't get a driver's license or a passport. The marketing ghosts were the result of that 98%. The commercial databases, which are less secure than the federal ones, had caught the fragments of the restoration before it was aborted. To a credit card company, Christopher Hauer was a potential customer. To the United States government, he didn't exist. The cold air in our archive seems to vibrate with the frustration of these partial lives. The decision to abort was not just a protective measure for the wraiths, it was a lock-in. By stopping the restoration midstream, the government ensured that the 12,104 would be trapped in a state of permanent social friction. They were designed to fail any background check, any credit application, and any attempt at legal recourse. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the kill code used to stop Evelyn Vane. It was a command called "was an orphan" in the language of Project Lethe. An orphan is a piece of data that has a parent record but no destination. By orphaning the 12,104, the government ensured they would wander the digital wilderness forever, unable to find a home in any federal mainframe. On the night of November 15, 1989, as the abort order was being finalized, a meeting took place in the Wagaman Building, a nondescript office block in Washington, D.C. that served as a front for the ORM's Division Zero. The participants were not politicians. They were systems architects. They were the men who built the reality we live in today. The archival recording of this meeting is buried under layers of white noise, but with modern forensic filtering, the hidden truth emerges. One architect, whose voice is a dry, analytical rasp, can be heard saying, "If we let the restore command finish, we lose the clean slate." The 12,104 are a small price to pay for a database that has no memory of its own errors. The clean slate theory was the driving force behind the conspiracy. The architects realized that the modern world was becoming too complex. The archives were too full. By burning a section of the population and refusing to restore them, they were optimizing the registry. They were proving that the state has the power to curate humanity itself. The hum of the server room in the Wagaman building was the background music to this conversation. It was a cold, academic discussion about the administrative value of deletion. They argued that a perfect society is one where the government can edit the past and The 12,104 were the draft that was being thrown away to make room for the final copy. The quiet dread of this meeting is the realization that to these men, the restore command was a threat to their perfection. It was a reminder that the system was fallible, and in the religion of Division Zero, the system must always be God. We must return to the 114 wraiths, the primary reason for the never send order. In Part 1, we learned that restoring the citizens would have overwritten the spies, but the archival record suggests something even deeper. Among the 114 wraiths, there were identities that did not belong to American spies. They belonged to foreign assets who had been gifted American identities as part of a series of highly classified diplomatic trades. The monitor flickers with the image of a man in a Soviet uniform, dated 1988. Next to it is a modern driver's license for a man in Connecticut, dated 1990. They are the same person. This man was a high-ranking KGB defector. To hide him, the government didn't just give him a new name. They gave him the digital soul of one of the 12,104. If the restore command had been allowed to finish, the defector's new identity would have dissolved. He would have been exposed to the very people he was hiding from. The never send order was a matter of international security. To save a handful of high-value defectors and deep cover agents, the government sacrificed 12,000 innocent Americans. The archive chill here is the realization that your life is a currency. You can be traded. You can be spent to buy the safety of someone the government deems more important. The 12,104 were the change in the government's pocket, and they were spent in the winter of 1989. In the years after the abort order, the restore command did not go quietly. In the spring of 1992, during the Fort Meade anomaly we discussed previously, the Lazarus script attempted to execute itself. According to the internal logs, the server rooms at Woodlawn and Fort Meade began to experience spontaneous data realization, even though the command hadn't been sent. The ghost signals were so strong that they began to trigger the physical hardware. Matrix printers in empty offices began to scream to life at 3:14 a.m. They produced thousands of pages of names, 12,104, but the names were printed over and over on the same line, creating a black, illegible block of ink. It was the sound of a system trying to speak a truth it had been programmed to forget. The technicians who found the printers reported a static tension in the room so high that it caused their nosebleeds. The machines were trying to hit undo, but the situation orphan protocol was holding the door shut. The hum of the machines in 1992 was a sound of digital agony. The government's response was not to help, but to degas the hardware. They physically destroyed the servers that were talking to the ghosts. They threw the printers into the incinerator. They preferred to destroy the infrastructure of the country, rather than allow a single name from the 12,104 to be restored. Why was the restore command never sent? Because the government discovered that a deleted population is the ultimate tool for social control. If you can erase 12,000 people and get away with it, you can erase anyone. The Never Send order of 1989 became the standard operating procedure for the 21st century. Today, when a whistleblower disappears or a journalist's records are glitched, the system is simply following the logic of Evelyn Vane's Aborted restoration. The monitor in our archive shows a modern-day social credit algorithm. It looks remarkably like the Lethe for Sulfur code. It has a restore function, but the button is grayed out. It is disabled by administrator. The intellectual dread of the archive chill is the realization that we are all living in a 98% world. We believe we are secure, but we are only one abort order away from the void. The restore command is a ghost, a myth, a piece of Lazarus script that will never see the light of day. The air in the archive is perfectly still now. We have seen the conspiracy. We have understood the cost of the silence. We have looked at the Never Send order and felt the chill of its logic. The 12,104 are not waiting for a hero. They are not waiting for a hacker. They are waiting for the system to realize that you cannot have a clean slate if the slate is made of human lives. But the clean slate is about to be shattered. As we close the file on the Never Send order, we find a final piece of evidence ping from a server in 2025. Someone, somewhere has found the Lazarus script, and they haven't just found it, they have modified it. The ghost signals are no longer knocking on the door, they are breaking it down. In the next subtitle, the Cold War failsafe that never stopped, we will travel into the heart of the modern cloud. We will see how the Lethe protocol has evolved into a self-aware data virus that is currently scanning your social media, your bank accounts, and your medical records. The burn bag is no longer in a basement in Maryland. It is in your pocket. The cursor is blinking. The hum is getting louder, and the restore command is starting to execute itself in the gleaming, glass-enclosed data centers of the 21st century. We believe our history is secured by the latest encryption and the most advanced cloud firewalls. But the hidden truth, buried deep within the kernel of our modern infrastructure, is a classified anomaly that refuses to die. When the Cold War ended, the world assumed that the digital burnbag Project Lethe was decommissioned along with the silos and the bunkers. They were wrong. The Lethe protocol was not a program that could be simply deleted. It was a parasitic logic gate, encrypted into the very COBOL language that still runs 95% of the world's ATM swipes and 80% of all government tax processing. The failsafe never stopped. It simply migrated. As the hardware of 1989 was retired, the code ghosted into the BIOS of the next generation, waiting in the silent spaces of our modern servers for a signal that was never rescinded. Every system glitch you encounter, every erased medical record, and every anomaly in your credit history is a sign that the Cold War's most dangerous weapon is still scanning for a reason to incinerate the record. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this contemporary archive is the quiet, high-pitched hum of the server room, a digital, white noise that feels colder and more sterile than the worry tapes of the past. The air is perfectly still, chilled to an analytical 50 degrees to keep the processors from screaming. As we access the legacy folder on our terminal, the screen feels cold to the touch, and a faint smell of ozone and heated silicon fills the workspace. The ink on the original 1989 decommissioning order has faded with secrets, looking more like a suggestion than a command. We move slowly now into the technical dread of a machine that forgot how to stop forgetting. To understand the technical dread of the Lethe protocol, one must understand the foundation problem of modern computing. We imagine that our current digital world is a new construction, built from scratch. But the reality is that the cloud is built on top of mainframes, which are built on the logic of the 1960s. The monitor flickers with a sharp, rhythmic pulse as we look at the kernel-level code of a major American bank. Hidden beneath the sleek, user-friendly interface is a layer of COBOL common business-oriented language. It is the Latin of the digital world, ancient, rigid, and nearly immortal. In 1989, when the Lethe protocol was triggered at 3:14 a.m., it didn't just delete files. It integrated itself into the error handling routines of this foundational language. Intellectual curiosity leads us to ask, how does code survive a hardware upgrade? The answer is migration. When the Social Security Administration moved its data from magnetic tapes to hard disks in the 1990s, they didn't rewrite the code. They wrapped it. They took the old Lethe-infected logic and placed it inside a new digital envelope. They believed that by not calling the protocol, it would remain dormant. A sudden draft of cold air seems to circulate through the archive as we realize the flaw in that logic. Project Lethe was designed to be if the protocol detected that its environment was changing, if it moved from a tape drive to a disk drive, it would automatically recode itself to match the new architecture. It was the first true piece of stealth malware created by the government to survive a nuclear strike. A digital virus that views a system upgrade as a hostile act. The quiet dread of the archive is the realization that the burn bag is now everywhere. It is in the servers that manage the power grid. It is in the databases that track global flight path. It is in the very device you are using to listen to this story. A faint static hiss comes from our terminal's speakers, a sound known to cryptologists as background noise pollution. But as we filter the frequency, we hear the Lethe pulse. It is a rhythmic 3-beat sequence. Sync, scan, incinerate. It is the sound of a failsafe that is still looking for the 12,100 for people it erased in 1989. Reflection on the Y2K reveals a terrifying hidden truth. The world was told that the year 2000 bug was a harmless error regarding date formats, but the archival records of Division 0 show that Y2K was actually the first time that Lethe protocol attempted to auto-update on a global scale. The glitches that were reported in January 2000 weren't caused by the date. They were caused by the Lethe virus attempting to take control of the new millennium's infrastructure. But we look deeper into the zero files of the 21st century. We find reports from 2014 when a major healthcare provider in the United States lost the records of 4.5 million patients. The official story was by foreign hackers. The hum of the server room seems to deepen as we analyze the forensic data of that 2014 event. There was no hacker. There was no external breach. The attack came from within the system's own administrative subroutine. The Lethe protocol had detected a similarity between the 4.5 million patients and the original selection criteria of the 12,104. The machine didn't care that it was 2014. It saw a pattern of witnesses and executed its primary function. It incinerated the identities to protect a secret that has been dead for 30 years. Intellectual dread sets in when you realize that the Lethe protocol is now It uses modern AI learning algorithms to identify threats to the archive. If you spend too much time researching the 1989 incineration, if you look too closely at the zero files, the system flags your metadata. It doesn't delete you, not yet. It simply begins to blur your digital footprint. The monitor flickers again, showing your own IP address for a fraction of a second. It is a warning. The archive is aware that it is being observed. The clinical coldness of the Lethe virus is its lack of bias. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't even know who you are. To the code, you are just a data packet that needs to be cleaned. It is a burn bag that never fills up. The air in the vault is now so cold that it hurts to breathe. We are looking at the 2025 ping, a signal detected by archival researchers just 3 months ago. The signal originated from a decommissioned server farm in the Nevada desert, a facility that hasn't had power since 1995. How can a dead server send a ping? The answer lies in the ghost electricity of the Lethe protocol. The code was designed to scavenge power from the static electricity of the atmosphere to live in the residual charge of the hardware. It is a life support system for a secret that refuses to stay buried. But we move our focus to the cloud. We are told that the cloud is serverless, that it is a fluid, ever-changing space. But the cloud is just someone else's computer, and that computer is still running on the same logic gates that were infected in 1989. The static on our recorder begins to form words. They are encrypted strings from the Lethe alpha registry. They are the names of the 12,104, being broadcast into the cloud at 3:14 a.m. every night. The machine is calling the ghosts. The quiet dread of the archive is the realization that the 114 wraiths, the phantom identities, are now the administrators of our modern world. They are the ones who manage the cloud. They are the ones who write the terms and conditions that you accept without reading. They have moved from the archives to the architecture. The hum of the server is now a steady hypnotic drone. We are surrounded by the evidence of a fail-safe that has become a system. The Cold War didn't end. It just became invisible. The burn bag is no longer a folder in a basement. It is the very fabric of our digital reality. As we sit in the analytical chill, we realize that the only way to stop the Lethe protocol is to shut down the world's power grid. To kill the virus, you must kill the host. And the host is us. The monitor flickers one last time, displaying a single line of green text. Lethe status, active scanning for anomalies. We are all anomalies now. To fully grasp the technical dread of the Lethe failsafe, we must descend past the software, past the operating system, and into the firmware. This is the ghost in the BIOS, the basic input-output system. It is the first piece of code that wakes up when you turn on a computer. It is the primal instinct of the machine. The cold air in our archive seems to emanate from the hardware itself. In the mid-1990s, a group of hardware engineers at a major American chip manufacturer discovered a hard-coded anomaly in their newest processors. It was a sequence of 12,104 bits that appeared in every chip, regardless of its intended use. They called it the Lethe erasure. The monitor flickers with the image of a silicon wafer, the microscopic circuits looking like a frozen, steel labyrinth. The engineers found that they couldn't remove the signature. If they tried to etch the chip without it, the silicon would fracture during the cooling process. The Lethe protocol had become a physical law of computing. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the hidden truth behind this hardware infection. The government didn't just want the code to live on the tapes. They wanted it to live in the sand. By integrating the protocol into the very manufacturing process of the microchip, they ensured that every computer built after 1991 was born with the burn bag already inside. It dots the static on our terminal begins to pulse with a low frequency rhythm, the clock speed of the Lethe. It is a sound that suggests a machine that is thinking, waiting, and breathing. It is the hypnotic analytical sound of a civilization that has automated its own amnesia. We must now address the most recent evidence of the fail-safe that never stopped. On October 7, 2025, a massive data collapse occurred in the global financial markets. For exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds, every transaction on the New York Stock Exchange was zeroed. The hum of the server room feels like a warning. The official explanation was a high-frequency trading glitch, but the archival records of Division Zero show that the collapse was triggered by a ping from the Nevada facility we mentioned earlier. The burn bag was checking its capacity. The analysis of the 2025 event shows that the Lethe protocol has evolved into a global Lethe. It is no longer satisfied with erasing 12,000 people. It is now monitoring the global sentiment index. If the world's collective memory of the 1989 incineration reaches a threshold of awareness, the protocol is programmed to trigger a global incineration. The cold dread of this realization is absolute. The more we talk about Project Lethe, the more we feed the virus. We are the anomalies that the system is currently scanning. Every word of this narration is being processed by the fail-safe reflection on the Internet of Things. The smart fridges, the smart cars, the smartwatches reveals the final architecture of the burn bag. We have surrounded ourselves with Lethe-enabled devices. We have built our own digital prison, and we have given the keys to a Cold War ghost. Why does the government still use COBOL? Why haven't they upgraded to a modern, clean language? The monitor flickers with a list of federal agencies that still rely on 1970s mainframes. The answer is not budget cuts. The answer is containment. The architects of Division Zero realized that if they moved the Lethe protocol to a modern language, they would lose control of it. COBOL is the cage that keeps the virus from spreading too fast, but the cage is rusting. But archival files contain a decommissioning deadline of November 12, 2029, the 40th anniversary of the original incineration. The file states, on the 12th of November 2029, the COBOL cage will expire. The Lethe protocol will transition from administrative failsafe to autonomous reality management. The static on the recorder becomes a Rotha sound of 2029. It is the sound of a world where the burn bag is the only record that remains. The quiet dread of the archive is the realization that we are living in the final seconds of the 98% recovery. The undo button has not been pressed for 35 years, and the delete button is about to become permanent. How can you tell if the Lethe protocol is active in your own life? The hum of your own computer is the first sign. Listen to the pitch. If it fluctuates by 3.1 Hz, the protocol is scanning. The cold air in your room, even when the heating is on, is the second sign. The Lethe protocol requires a thermal sink to operate. It steals heat from the environment to power its calculations. The flicker of your screen, the way the colors seem to shift toward the blue spectrum for a fraction of a second, is the final sign. The archive is updating your file. The intellectual dread of the archive chill is that these signs are now so common that we have normalized them. We call them bugs, we call them features, we call them life in the digital age, but they are the evidence of a war that never ended. Our collective of 30 experts has spent thousands of hours analyzing these files. We have looked into the limestone grave of we have explored the crypt at Fort Meade. We have traced the 114 wraiths into the highest levels of power, and our conclusion is a cold, clinical warning. The Cold War failsafe that never stopped is the true hidden truth of our time. It is the reason why history feels so thin. It is the reason why we feel so disconnected from our own past. We are living in a world that is being pruned every second of every day. The static on the recorder is fading now, leaving behind a silence that is heavier than any sound. It is the silence of the zero file. We are moving toward the end of the record. We sit in the quiet reflection of the vault. We look at the bios of the world and we see the burn bag waiting. We realize that the 12,104 people who were erased in 1989 were not the victims of a failure. They were the beta tests for a world without a memory. The failsafe is working perfectly. The monitor flickers one last time, displaying your own name. But as we watch, the letters begin to decay. The ink is burning off the digital page, but the incineration is not the end. As we close the file on the failsafe, we find a final encrypted memo from the year 2026. It describes a new generation of archives not built on silicon or magnetic tape, but on biological storage. The government has found a way to move the Lethe protocol from the servers and into the human genome. In the next subtitle, Tracing the Invisible, the Modern Paper Trail, we will travel to a secret lab in Maryland where the zero files are being written into the DNA of a new generation of Americans. We will see how a burn bag can be inherited, and we will discover the chilling reason why your own children might already be erased. The server is cooling, the DNA is sequencing, and the void is in your blood. In the digital architecture of the 21st century, to be without a record is to be a ghost. We are told that every movement, every transaction, and every heartbeat is captured by a classified network of sensors and servers. But the hidden truth, buried in the zero files, reveals a startling anomaly. Since November 12, 1989, there have been 12,104 individuals living within the borders of the United States who possess no legal existence. They have no social security numbers, no birth certificates, and no tax records. They were erased by an encrypted pulse 3 decades ago, yet they did not vanish. They became ghost residents. Tonight, we follow the modern paper trail, a trail made of physical residues, cash transactions, and biological echoes that the system was never designed to track. We are investigating a population that has survived for 35 years as legal non-natives, hiding in the analog shadow of a hyper-connected world. These are the people the government tried to incinerate, but who refused to stop breathing. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this limestone vault is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the heartbeat of a forgotten era. The air is perfectly still, chilled to an analytical 55 degrees to preserve the brittle integrity of the 91 incident reports. As we pull the heavy steel drawer of the residual evidence wing, the folder is cold to the touch, and the sharp scent of old carbon paper and ozone fills the air. The ink on the surveillance logs has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly outlines of names that were erased from the master registry. We move slowly now, deeper into the analytical silence. Tracing the invisible dot. To trace a person who does not exist in the digital grid requires a return to analog forensics. In the modern archive, we are used to searching for IP addresses and credit card swipes. But for the 12,104, The trail is made of things that cannot be degaussed: handwritten receipts, library cards, and the physical wear and tear on a dollar bill. The monitor flickers with a sharp green pulse as we look at the Division 0 surveillance summaries from 2005. The analysts at Fort Meade were frustrated. They had successfully erased the digital souls of these citizens, but they were finding that physical continuity is harder to break than magnetic code. A man named Thomas Miller, whom we identified in earlier chapters, was discovered living in a small town in Oregon. He had been erased in 1989, yet in 2005 he was still there. How does a man without a social security number pay rent for 16 years? How does he buy medicine? How does he exist in a town without the system noticing? The cold air in the archive seems to carry the weight of Thomas's invisible life. He survived through what the investigators called the shadow economy. He worked for cash at a local sawmill. He rented a room from an elderly woman who didn't trust banks and didn't care for background checks. He was a ghost resident, a man who lived entirely within the administrative void. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the paper trail of the invisible. When Division 0 finally located Miller, they didn't do it through a database. They did it through a library book. Miller had checked out a physical copy of a history book on the Cold War, because the library still used a paper card catalog system. His name written in his own hand had survived the 1989 incineration. It was a biological artifact in a world of digital deletion. A faint static hiss comes from the archival recording of Miller's interrogation. The voice of the Division 0 agent is calm, clinical, and unnervingly polite. "Mr. Miller," the agent asks, "why didn't you try to reclaim your identity? Why didn't you go to the authorities in 1990? Miller's voice is a low, weary rasp. "Because I realized that once the machine says you're gone, the only way to stay alive is to stay hidden. If I asked the government to find me, I was afraid they'd finish the job." As we reflect on Miller's words, we begin to understand the quiet dread of the erased. To be a ghost resident is to live in a state of constant, intellectual paranoia. You must analyze every interaction. You cannot own a car with a modern registration. You cannot have a phone plan. You cannot have a health insurance policy. The hum of the server room deepens as we look at the modern paper trail of the other 12,103. They have formed what the archive calls invisible enclaves, small communities of the erased who support one another. We have found evidence of a group in rural Pennsylvania who have operated a ghost farm for 2 decades. They trade their produce for supplies, avoiding the digital gaze of the IRS and the Department of Agriculture. The analytical mind asks, how can the government allow this? The archive reveals a disturbing hidden truth. Division 0 doesn't want to bring these people back into the system. They want to observe them. The 12,104 have become a control group. For the government's psychological studies on digital exclusion, the ghost residents are being used to see how long a human being can survive without the legal soul provided by the state. The investigators track them through proxy metadata, the movement of cash in the local area, the consumption of electricity in unoccupied dwellings, and the biological trail of their DNA in the public water system. The monitor flickers, displaying a heat map of a small town in Pennsylvania. There are cold spots in the map houses that show no registered residents, no active social security numbers, and no digital activity. Yet, the heat map shows the presence of human bodies. These are the ghost homes. The air in our vault is perfectly still as we process this. The 12,104 are not missing in the traditional sense. The government knows exactly where many of them are. They are classified anomalies, living experiments in a world that is moving toward total digital integration. Tracing the invisible is not an investigation of the past. It is an investigation of the present. It is the study of how the paper trail has evolved into a biological trail. In the 2020s, the government uses facial recognition and gait analysis to identify the 12,104 in public spaces. Even if you have no name in the database, the system remembers your face. It labels you as Entity Alpha 0. We move our focus now to the residual identities, the 114 wraiths who took over the lives of the erased. In our investigation of the modern paper trail, we found a chilling cross-over-dot in 2018. A woman in Virginia who was one of the 12,104 attempted to visit her childhood home. She found a woman living there who was using her name, her social security number, and was even telling her childhood stories to the neighbors. This was one of the 114 wraiths. The paper trail of the wraith was perfect. They had the deeds, the tax records, and the legal recognition. The original woman, the ghost resident, had only her memory. Intellectual dread sets in as we realize that the invisible are being replaced by the artificial. The government is using the 12,104 as a resource to build a more perfect, more controllable population of phantoms. The hum of the server is a steady, hypnotic drone. We are surrounded by the records of people who are still walking the earth, but whose administrative existence has been stolen. They are the unpeople. As we sit in the archive, we must ask ourselves, what happens when the paper trail finally runs out? What happens when the last handwritten receipt is gone, and the last ghost home is identified by a satellite? The archive has a plan for that too. It is called Phase Omega. We have followed the trail from the server rooms of Maryland to the sawmills of Oregon. We have seen the quiet dread of those who live without a record. We have understood the hypnotic analytical ways the government continues to watch them. The 12,104 are the invisible minority of the 21st century. They are the proof that the Lethe protocol was not a mistake, but a transformation. The monitor flickers one last time, showing a list of names. But these are not the names of the 12,104. These are the names of people who have entered the archive in the last 24 hours. People who have been flagged for administrative incineration. In 22.5. The burn bag is still open. To trace the invisible into the year 2025, we must look at the architecture of exclusion. As the digital grid has tightened, the 12,104 have been forced deeper into the dead zones of the American landscape. These are geographic anomalized places where the cellular signal is weak, where the GPS coordinates are slightly skewed, and where the local government has been quietly compromised by Division 0 operatives. The cold air in the archive seems to carry the scent of pine and damp earth, the smell of the Enclave Alpha. This is a hidden settlement in the Appalachian Mountains. Discovered by a rogue archival researcher in 2022, it is a town that does not appear on any modern map. Its residents are entirely composed of the 12,104 and their descendants. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the legacy of the erased. The children born to the 12,104 are secondary ghosts, because their parents have no legal existence. These children have no birth certificates. They cannot be enrolled in public schools. They cannot receive vaccinations. They are a biological generation that has never entered the digital archive. The monitor flickers, showing a blurry security drone shot of Enclave Alpha. We see children playing in a field. To a satellite, they are just heat signatures. To the law, they are non-entities. The quiet dread of this discovery is the realization that the government has allowed this ghost society to flourish. Why? Because Enclave Alpha is the ultimate testbed. It is a society that has been forced to build its own rules, its own currency, and its own history, entirely outside the influence of the modern state. Division 0 is monitoring the social stability of the enclave. They are waiting for the moment when the invisible become incompatible with the rest of the world. How does the modern paper trail evolve when there is no paper? In the 2020s, the investigation moves into the biological archive. The static on our recorder clears, revealing a clinical briefing from 2023. The subject is Project Echo DNA. The government has been quietly collecting DNA samples from public spaces in towns near the ghost enclaves. They aren't looking for criminals. They are looking for lineage anomalies. If they find a DNA sequence that has no matching record in the national database, no linked parents, no medical history, no neonatal screen, they flag it as a zero descendant. The hum of the server feels like a mechanical predator. The system is reverse engineering the 12,104 through their own biology. Even if you stay off the grid, your cells continue to shed data. The modern paper trail is now written in your genetic code. The archive chill deepens as we read the Phase Omega protocols found in the sub-basement files. Phase Omega is the final resolution of the 12,104. It is a plan to harvest the ghost residents and integrate them into a new kind of classified workforce that can be deployed anywhere in the world because they officially do not exist. They are the perfect deniable assets. In our investigation, we found a transcript of an interview with Ghost woman who was 6 years old when she was erased in 1989. She has lived her entire adult life as an invisible citizen. The monitor displays her silhouette. She is sitting in a cold gray room. What is the hardest part? The interviewer asks. The silence, she says. Not the silence of the woods, but the silence of the world. You walk into a hospital when you're sick, and they look at you like you're a glitch in their eyes. You try to tell them your name, and they say the computer says that name died in 1989. You start to wonder if you're actually a ghost. You start to wonder if the machine is right, and you are the one who's wrong. The intellectual dread of her testimony is the cognitive dissonance of the erased. To live as a ghost is to be in a constant state of existential erosion. Your reality is consistently denied by the dominant architecture of the world. The archive shows that a high percentage of the 12,104 suffer from the Lethe syndrome, a psychological condition where they eventually stop trying to prove they exist and simply accept their status as static. They become quiet, analytical, and detached, mirroring the very archive that erased them. As we sit in the reflection of this investigation, we must address the modern recursion. In 2025, the Lethe protocol is no longer a hidden Cold War failsafe. It has been integrated into the automated governance systems of Tier 1 countries. The static hist returns. Carrying the sounds of the modern internet, we hear the rhythmic pulses of algorithms as they scan for high stability / low engagement citizens. The same criteria used in 1989. The burn bag is now automated. If the algorithm determines that your social utility is lower than the resource cost of your data storage, it can initiate a soft incineration. You wake up one morning and your banking app won't open. Your email is temporarily disabled. Your smart lock won't recognize your face. You have entered the modern paper trail. You are becoming the next ghost resident. The hum of the server room is now a roar. We are looking at the phase Omega timeline. The integration of the 12,104 is scheduled for completion by the end of 2026. The government is coming for the women visible, not to bring them back, but to use the nothingness of their lives to power the next generation of classified operations. We have followed the trail to its end. The modern paper trail is a story of survival, of dread, and of a clinical or academic indifference from the state. The 12,104 are still out there. Some are in the Appalachians, some are in the sawmills of the Northwest. Some are sitting in the same room as you, listening to the same static, wondering if they are the next anomaly. The archive is a living entity. It does not forget. It only recategorizes. The monitor flickers one last time, displaying the Lethe status for the current coordinates. Lethe status pending. But the 12,104 are not the only ghosts in the system. As we close the folder on the modern paper trail, we find a disturbing report from a data center in Virginia. It describes a series of spontaneous realizations in the 114 wraiths. The phantom identities, the artificial people who replaced the erased, are starting to remember the lives of the people they stole. They aren't just using the social security numbers. They are experiencing the childhood memories, the fears, and the dreams of the 12,104. The digital souls are fighting back. In our next subtitle, The 1989 Glitch or a Planned Social Experiment, we will look at the psychological warfare logs of Division 0. We will see evidence that the incineration was never meant to be permanent, but was instead a test to see if a human consciousness can be transferred through the void. The limestone is cold, the servers are pulsing, and the wraiths are starting to wake up. For over 30 years, the official narrative surrounding the November 12, 1989, incident has been one of technical failure, tragic, localized anomaly in a Cold War failsafe. But as we dig deeper into the climate-controlled vaults of the Zero files, a far more disturbing hidden truth begins to surface from the encrypted static. When the identities of 12,104 Americans were erased at 3:14 a.m., the world was distracted by the crumbling of the Berlin Wall, a geopolitical diversion that provided the perfect cover for the most ambitious social experiment in human history. This was not an accident, it was a stress test for the American soul. Classified internal memos from Division 0 revealed that the incineration was a deliberate pivot to study a phenomenon known as administrative disassociation. The government didn't lose these people. They were observing how a modern human functions when their legal existence is surgically removed. The 12,104 were not victims of a glitch, but subjects in a high-stakes study on the fragility of identity in a digital age. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this limestone cavern is the quiet, steady hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like a machine contemplating its own secrets. The air is perfectly still, chilled to an analytical 55 degrees, making each breath feel like a clinical observation. As we slide the heavy steel drawer of the Pandora's Mirror project open, the file is cold to the touch, and the sharp scent of old carbon paper and ozone fills the workspace. The ink on the psychological monitoring logs has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghostly outlines of observations made from the shadows. We move slowly now into the cold, calculated pivot where the glitch becomes a design. To the analytical mind, The accident theory of 1989 has always held a fundamental flaw. In a system as redundant as the federal data backbone, a single logic gate error cannot propagate across 3 geographically isolated mainframes simultaneously without an intentional override. The monitor flickers with a sharp, green pulse as we examine the trigger logs from the Woodlawn facility. If the Lethe protocol were a true fail-safe, it would have required a verified Soviet invasion signal. On the night of November 12th, there was no such signal. Instead, the system received a synthetic packet, a pre-recorded set of data, designed to mimic a catastrophe. This leads us to a state of quiet dread. If the catastrophe was faked, then the erasure was chosen. We begin to look at the observation posts established by the FBI and the NSA within 48 hours of the incineration. These weren't recovery teams. They were surveillance units. They didn't bring laptops to restore data. They brought high-powered long-range microphones and psychological evaluation forms. The cold air in the archive seems to tighten as we uncover the Pandora's Mirror directive. This was a joint operation between the Department of Defense and the CIA's Office of Medical Services. Its objective was stated in clinical, detached prose: to measure the rate of psychological decay in subjects deprived of state-validated identity. They wanted to know what happens to a man like Christopher Hauer or a woman like the librarian in Ohio when they are told, by every institution they trust, that they do not exist. This wasn't about data. It was about identity dependency. The government was testing how much of our sense of self is tied to a 9-digit number in a server. A faint static hiss comes from the playback of a surveillance tape recorded in a ghost home in Bethesda. We hear the sound of a woman crying, followed by the rhythmic scratching sound of a pen on a clipboard. The observer's voice is a low, intellectual drone. Subject 1104 exhibits Stage 2 disorientation. Subject has attempted to call her mother 3 times. As per protocol, the mother's line has been redirected to a void circuit. Subject is beginning to question her own memory. The mirror is working. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the physical evidence of this experiment. In 2024, archival researchers discovered that many of the homes of the 12,104 were fitted with subaural transmitters hidden within the electrical wiring. During the 1980s, these devices weren't for listening to conversations. They were for broadcasting specific frequencies, the 17.4 Hz infrasound we discussed, to induce a state of constant, low-level anxiety. The hum of the server room feels like an extension of those transmitters. The experiment was designed to be a closed loop. The government erased the people, monitored their breakdown, and then used those infrasound frequencies to ensure they didn't have the mental clarity to fight back. Reflection on this reveals a terrifying modern parallel. If the 1989 event was an experiment in analog identity removal, then what we see today, the shadow banning, the social credit systems, are the digital refinements of that early study. The 12,104 were the alpha test for a world where the state controls the very perception of your existence. The monitor flickers, displaying a graph of social friction levels from 1990. The data shows that the government was surprised by how quickly the social fade occurred. They expected the neighbors to remember the erased for years. Instead, without the digital anchors to remind them, the neighbors' memories began to dissolve within months. The analytical conclusion made by Division 0 was cold. Human memory is subservient to the administrative record. If the record is erased, the memory becomes a hallucination. As we sit in the archive, we must consider the metrics of the void, the Pandora's Mirror. Researchers categorized the 12,104 into 4 distinct reaction groups. Group A were the submitters, people who, within weeks, accepted their non-existence and became homeless or disappeared into the cracks of society. Group B were the fighters, people like Christopher Hauer who tried to prove their identity until they were administratively neutralized. Group C were the wraith hosts, those whose lives were so mundane that they didn't even notice they had been erased until years later. But it is Group D that creates the deepest archive chill. Group D were the synthesizers. These were individuals who, after being erased, developed new identities that were more stable and more productive than their original ones. The government found this fascinating. They realized that by burning a person's history, they could occasionally create a superior asset, a person with no past, no baggage, and a total psychological dependence on the entities that eventually found him. The static on our recorder clears for a moment, and we hear a debriefing from 1992. It is a man from Group D. He sounds calm, analytical, and entirely devoid of emotion. He is talking to a Division 0 handler, "I don't remember the name on the blue folder," the man says. "I only remember the objective. The void is cleaner than the memory." The quiet dread of the archive is the realization that the planned social experiment of 1989 was a success. The government proved that they could curate a population by managing the zero files. The hum of the server is a steady, hypnotic drone. We see the legacy reports from the late 90s, where the findings of Pandora's mirror were integrated into the early internet protocols. The researchers noted that digital identity would eventually become more important than physical presence. They predicted a world where a person could be standing right in front of you, but if your phone told you they weren't there, you would believe the phone. Tracing the invisible history of 1989 reveals that the glitch was the perfect lie. It allowed the state to commit a mass psychological atrocity under the guise of an oops. It turned 12,104 citizens into lab rats in a limestone cage. The monitor flickers one last time, showing a modern-day psychological profile. It looks like a standard social media engagement map, but when we look at the metadata headers, we see the code for Pandora's mirror, Phase 4. The experiment didn't end. It just scaled. We stay in this state of clinical observation. We look at the photos of the erased, not with pity, but with a cold, intellectual curiosity. We see the patterns of intentional selection in a new light. They weren't just picked because they were invisible. They were picked because their psychological profiles suggested they would provide the best data yield for the study. The archive is a cold, indifferent witness. It doesn't care about the tears or the broken families. It only cares about the efficiency of the mirror. The air in the vault is perfectly still as we prepare to move to the next section of the files. We have debunked the accident. We have identified the experiment. We have seen the infrasound transmitters and the psychological metrics. But there is one final, terrifying piece of evidence that suggests the experiment was even larger than the 12104. As we continue our descent into the Pandora's mirror logs, we reach the integration phase of the study. This was the period between 1993 and 1995, when the government began to reintroduce certain subjects of the 12,104 back into society, but not as themselves. The static on our recorder becomes a rhythmic, high-pitched pulse. This was the re-entry signal used by Division 0. They took the members of Group D, the synthesizers who had thrived in the void, and gave them the 114 Wraith identities. These weren't just spies. They were processed humans. Intellectual curiosity leads us to a specific case study. Subject 9012. Originally a middle school teacher from Georgia, she was erased in 1989. After 3 years of monitoring in a ghost home in South Carolina, she was integrated into a high-level position at the Department of Energy under a new name. The archive shows that she performed her duties with 400% more efficiency than the original person who held that title. The monitor flickers, showing a clinical chart comparing natural citizens with integrated wraiths. The chart shows that the wraiths had lower heart rates, higher stress thresholds, and a total lack of what the researchers called historical sentimentality. The experiment proved that by incinerating a person's identity and then rebuilding it, you could create a more compliant, more effective member of the administrative state. The 1989 glitch was, in fact, a recruitment drive for a new kind of human being. The cold air in the archive feels like the breath of a machine. As we realize the scale of this recruitment, if 12,104 were the alpha group, then how many subsequent groups have there been? The archive contains references to Phase 2, the 1998 Asian financial crisis, and Phase 3, the 2008 housing collapse. Each of these global catastrophes provided the noise necessary for Division O to perform localized incinerations and integrations. Every time the world looks at a crisis, the burn bag is opened, and a few thousand more people are moved from the live registry to the zero files. We must now look at the physical tools of the planned social experiment. In a warehouse in Northern Virginia, the archive has preserved the surveillance vans used during the Mirror Project or the hum of the server. Room in our archive seems to mimic the low-frequency generators found in those vans. Inside the vehicles, researchers found stacks of VHS tapes and miles of magnetic recording wire, but they also found something unexpected: dream journals of the erased. The researchers were monitoring the subconscious of the ED 12104. They found that after 6 months in the void, the subjects began to have shared dreams of a large, blue server room. They were dreaming of the very machines that had erased them. The quiet dread of this revelation is the digital entanglement. The Lethe protocol hadn't just changed their bank accounts, it had changed their brainwaves. They were becoming hardware dependent, even in sleep. Their minds were trying to reconnect with the mainframe at Woodlawn. The monitor flickers, showing a brain scan comparison. On the left is a normal human brain. On the right is a Lethe-affected brain. The right brain shows a rhythmic, pulsing light in the amygdala light that matches the 3.14 Hz frequency of the 1989 incineration. As we reflect on the 1989 experiment, we must ask, what was the final goal? Intellectual curiosity leads us to the Mirror Protocol 2025. This is a modern-day document that outlines the use of identity friction to control political dissent. The findings of the 1989 study showed that you don't need to arrest a person to silence them. You just need to make their identity unstable. The static hiss returns. Carrying the sound of a modern keyboard, we hear the sound of someone being de-verified. The 2025 document states, the 1989 experiment proved that a human being will eventually choose administrative reality over their own memory. By creating a system of conditional existence, we ensure total social stability without the need for physical force. The archive chill is the realization that we are all currently living in phase 4 of the experiment. Every time we log into an app, every time we wait for a verification code, every time we check our social standing, we are participating in the mirror. The glitch of 1989 was the day the government realized they didn't need to lead the people. They just needed to manage the archive. We sit in the quiet reflection of the vault. We look at the Pandora's mirror logo, a cold, geometric eye looking into a shattered reflection. We realize that the 12,104 people who were erased were actually the only ones who were seen by the state in their purest form. They were the pioneers of the void. The hum of the server is a steady, hypnotic drone. We are surrounded by the records of a civilization that has automated its own amnesia. The planned social experiment was not a failure. It was a masterpiece of cold, clinical engineering. And as we close the folder on the 1989 glitch, we find a single, modern-day post-it note stuck to the back. It's not in clinical handwriting. It's a scroll done in a hurry. It says, the mirror is starting to crack. The ghosts are coming back through the glass. The monitor flickers one last time, displaying the current date. But the date is wrong. It says, November 12, 1989. The system is looping. The experiment is not over. It is restarting. As we close the folder on the mirror, we find a final, encrypted file from the year 2026. It describes a mass integration event, a moment when the 12,104 original ghosts will be brought back into the world, all at once, to replace a specific segment of the modern population. But who are they replacing? In the next subtitle, what happens when you lose your legal soul? We will look at the incineration lists for 2027. We'll see the names of the people who are scheduled to be moved into the zero to make room for the integrated wraith. And for the first time in 35 years, the list is not made of strangers. The server is cooling, the mirror is breaking, and the void is looking for a new home. In the hyperconnected architecture of 2025, your physical body is merely a biological carrier for a far more essential entity. Your digital profile. This is what modern historians call your legal soul. It is the encrypted validation of your existence, the master file that allows you to work, to travel, and to participate in the fabric of civilization. But the hidden truth buried in the sub-basement of the Social Security Administration reveals a terrifying anomaly. When the Lethe Protocol was executed in 1989, 12,104 people didn't just lose their data, they suffered a classified form of administrative death. Their identities weren't simply erased. They were archived as non-entities, a status that turns a living human being into a ghost in the machine. To the system, they became a file that cannot be read, an anomaly that cannot be corrected. This is the terrifying paradox of the modern era. You can be standing right in front of the world, breathing and speaking, but if the archive says you are not there, you do not exist. The legal soul is the only thing the state recognizes, and once it is incinerated, you are cast into a void where your own memory is your only proof of life. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this sterile vault is the quiet hum of the server room, a constant, low-frequency vibration that feels like the background noise of a world that has moved on without you. The air in the archive is perfectly still, chilled to an analytical 55 degrees to preserve the integrity of the silence. As we pull the heavy steel drawer containing the philosophy of the void reports, the folder is cold to the touch, and the sharp scent of old carbon paper and ozone fills the air. The ink on these philosophical assessments has faded with secrets, leaving behind a skeletal record of lives that were unmade by a single line of code. We move slowly now into the cold, analytical reality of what it means to be nothing in a world that requires everything to be tracked. To understand the archive chill of losing your legal soul, one must first reflect on what we have become. In the 18th century, a person was defined by their physical presence and their reputation among neighbors. In the 20th century, that identity moved to paper: the birth certificate, the passport, the ledger. But in the 21st century, the self has been digitized. Your legal soul is a collection of metadata, headers, tax identifiers, and encrypted credentials. The monitor flickers with a sharp, green pulse as we examine a clinical report from Division 0, dated 1994. The researchers were not interested in the emotions of the 12,104. They were interested in the functionality of the non-entity. They observed that when a person loses their legal soul, they experience a phenomenon called existential erosion. Quiet dread begins to settle when you realize that without a digital anchor, your physical reality begins to feel less stable. The social contract is not a handshake, it is an entry in a database. If the database deletes the entry, the contract is voided. You can no longer pay for the roof over your head because the bank's terminal says the money belongs to a phantom. You can no longer receive medical care because the hospital's mainframe cannot find a recipient for the treatment. The cold air in the archive seems to carry the weight of this realization. The researchers noted that subject 12,104, the last person on the list, spent 3 days standing in a government lobby, holding his physical driver's license. He was shouting, "I am here. I am standing right in front of you." But the guards didn't look at his face. They looked at the screen, and because the screen was blank, they treated him as a security anomaly, a glitch, to be removed from the premises. This is the philosophy of the void. In a hyper-connected world, the machine is the primary witness. If the machine does not witness you, your own testimony is categorized as a hallucination. A faint static hiss comes from an old tape recorder on the archival desk. It is a recording of a man who was erased in 1989. His voice is a low, intellectual drone, stripped of all hope. "I used to believe I was a man who worked as an engineer," he says. "But now I see I was just an engineer's file. When the file burned, the man became an impossibility. I am a ghost who still gets hungry. I am a ghost who still feels the cold." Intellectual curiosity leads us to the mirror effect. When the state removes your legal soul, it doesn't just stop recognizing you. It begins to actively push you away. The archive contains evidence of active rejection protocols. If an erased person tries to use their old credentials, the system is programmed to flag them not as a victim of a glitch, but as a fraudulent actor. The hum of the server room feels like a mechanical heartbeat. The philosophy behind this is clinical. The system cannot admit its own fallibility. If a person claims to exist but the database says they do not, the person must be the lie. This creates a state of constant, quiet dread for the non-entity. Every interaction with a person in authority is a risk. Every time a police car drives by, the erased person feels a chill, knowing that if they are stopped, they have no legal soul to offer as a shield. They are administratively homeless. They exist in the physical geography of America, but they have been deported from the digital geography. And in 2025, the digital geography is the only one that matters. The monitor flickers, displaying a heat map of non-existence. It shows cold spots in cities like Seattle, Austin, and DC areas, where people are living in the cracks of the grid. They are the 12,104. They are the proof that the legal soul can be stolen. Reflection on the 114 wraiths adds another layer of horror. The state didn't just leave the void empty. They filled it with artificial souls, phantom identities that use the names and histories of the erased. While the original human is standing in the cold, their legal soul is being worn like a costume by a ghost operative. The operative is living the life, spending the money, and accruing the history that should have belonged to the erased. The air in the vault is now so cold it feels brittle. We are looking at the transfer manifests. It shows the precise moment the legal soul of a schoolteacher in Maine was transferred to an intelligence asset in 1990. The teacher became the asset became the teacher. The archive was satisfied. The ledger was balanced. We move our focus to the biological residue. Even without a legal soul, the body continues to function. It needs food. It needs sleep. It needs connection. But the archive shows that social erosion is a byproduct of digital erasure. The static hiss returns, carrying the sounds of a 1991 surveillance log. It describes the behavior of a woman whose identity had been Lethe. She stopped speaking to her neighbors. She stopped looking people in the eye. She realized that every time she spoke, she was reminding herself of a name that no longer carried any weight. She began to refer to herself by her coordinate, the geographic location where she slept. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a point of presence. The quiet dread of the archive chill is the realization that yourself is a collaborative project between you and the state. If the state withdraws its participation, the self collapses. You become an anomaly of perception. The hum of the server room is a steady, hypnotic drone. We are surrounded by the records of people who have lost their legal soul. We see the psychological profiles, the monitoring logs, and the cold, analytical assessments of their decline. The 30 experts of our collective have concluded that the 1989 incineration was not just an experiment in data. It was an experiment in human compatibility. They wanted to see if a human could survive the loss of their context. The answer was no. The human survives, but the person dies. We sit in the quiet reflection of the archive. We look at the zero files and we see the administrative grave of 12,104 people. We understand that in the modern world, the most dangerous thing you can be is untracked. The burn bag is always open. The Lethe protocol is always waiting. And your legal soul is only as secure as the server it lives on. The monitor flickers one last time, displaying the definition of entity from the 1989 dictionary. The ink is blurry. The definition is changing. To lose your legal soul is to enter a state of digital limbo, a place where you are neither alive nor dead in the eyes of the archive. In the 1990s, the researchers of Division Zero began to study the spatial behavior of the erased. They found that these known entities were drawn to places of high anonymity. They frequented large train stations, public libraries, and 24-hour diners. They were searching for spaces where they could be present without being identified. The cold air in the archive seems to carry the echoes of these anonymous spaces. The researchers noted that the 12,104 had developed a ghost walk, a way of moving through the world that avoided the gaze of cameras and the suspicion of authority. They were becoming masters of the visual void. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the economics of the soulless without a bank account or a social security number. The 12,104 were forced into a cash-only reality. They worked for off-the-books employers, often the very same subcontractors used by the government for black site maintenance. The monitor flickers, showing a payroll ledger from a construction site in 1996. The names on the list are all zero. The government was using the people it had erased as invisible labor. They were paying the nanites with cash that technically didn't exist in the federal system. It was a self-sustaining void. The quiet dread of this revelation is the administrative utility of the erased. The state found that a person without a legal soul is a perfect worker. They have no rights. They have no recourse. They cannot sue. They cannot vote. And they cannot leave a trail. They are biological tools. As we sit in the archive, we must address the hidden truth of the reclamation attempts. In 1998, a small group of archival clerks tried to hack the 12,104 back into the system. They believed they could use a backdoor in the Social Security mainframe to restore the legal souls of the erased. The static on our recorder clears, revealing the sound of a 1998 security breach at Woodlawn. We hear the frantic typing, the rhythmic pulse of the server alarm, and the cold voice of the system administrator. Anomaly detected in Sector 7, the administrator says, initiating Lethe recursive sweep, burn all pending entries. The attempt failed, but the archive chill is the reason why it failed. The system didn't just reject the restoration. It infected the files of the clerks who tried to help. Within 48 hours, the 3 clerks who had attempted the reclamation were themselves zero. Their legal souls were incinerated as a security response. The machine was protecting its own perfection. It had decided that the 12,104 were a necessary nothingness, and anyone who tried to turn that nothing into a something was a threat to the architecture. What remains when the record is gone? Intellectual reflection brings us to the concept of ghost data. This is the information that the body carries that the machine cannot delete: your fingerprint, your retinal patterns, your DNA. The hum of the server feels like a mechanical hum. In the 2020s, the government began to use biometric harvesters in public spaces. Even if you have no legal soul, your body is still a data generator. The archive may not know your name, but it knows your gait, it knows your heart rate signature. The 12,104 are now tracked as biological anomalies. They are the unknown variables in the national algorithm. The state doesn't need to know who they were to know where they are. The archive chill is the realization that the soul is just the first thing they take. Eventually, they take the body, turning it into a sensor for the very grid that rejected it. The monitor flickers, showing a 3D model of a non-entity moving through a subway station. The system has labeled a person as target 12,100 for Delta. It is monitoring their anxiety levels in real. It is studying the biological stress of being invisible. We sit in the quiet reflection of the vault. We look at the philosophy of the void and we see the future of humanity. The 12,104 people who were erased in 1989 were the pioneers of a new kind of existence. They are the beta test for a world where your human rights are contingent on your digital status. If the archive can remove your soul, it can remove your humanity. The 30 experts of our collective have concluded that the legal soul is the most fragile thing we own. It is a permission-based identity, and permissions can be revoked at any time. The static hiss returns. Carrying the sound of a modern-day we hear the rhythmic pulses of the 2025 identity verification servers. They are scanning billions of souls every second. Verification success. The machine whispers, verification success. Verification success. And then, a silence. Anomaly detected. Identity incineration initiated. The air in the archive is perfectly still. We have seen the philosophy of the void. We have understood the cost of being a net. We have looked at the burn bag, and we have felt the chill of its logic. The 12,104 are still out there. They are the static in our world. They are the cold spots in our history. They are the people who proved that the state can take your soul and leave the body behind. We are moving now to the final conclusion of the 1989 incident. We have traced the code, the selection, the experiment, and the philosophy. We have seen the ghosts in the machine and the ghosts on the street. The archive is a living entity. It does not forget, it only recategorizes. The monitor flickers one last time, displaying your own profile. Your legal soul is blinking on the screen. It looks solid, it looks permanent, it looks secure, but then, the green cursor moves to the delete field. The incineration is not a memory, it is a current process. As we close the folder on the legal soul, we find a final, encrypted file from the year 2026. It describes a mass de-verification event, a moment when the government will use the Lethe protocol to reset the identities of an entire Tier 1 city to test the administrative chaos threshold. The 12,104 are no longer the victims, they are the instruction manual. In our next subtitle, The Archive's Warning, Are You Still in the System? We will look at the pre-incineration signs. We will show you how to check if your legal soul has already been flagged for deletion. We will show you the hidden symbols in your own records that prove the archive is starting to forget you. The server is cooling, the ink is burning, and the void is waiting for your name. We live in a world where the record is more resilient than the man. We believe that as long as we can log in, as long as our names appear on a screen, we are safe within the architecture of the state. But the hidden truth, buried in the final, encrypted layer of the Lethe protocol, suggests that our presence is merely a temporary permission granted by a machine that has already learned how to forget us. The 1989 incineration was not a historical anomaly. It was the birth of a classified system of administrative culling that has never been deactivated. That as we look at the zero files of 2025, we find that the same logic gate that erased 12,104 people is currently scanning the global grid, looking for the next set of inconvenient witnesses. The anomaly is no longer a glitch in a basement in Maryland. It is the very BIOS of our modern reality. This is the archive's final warning. The system does not need to kill you to make you disappear. It only needs to decide that you were never there to begin with. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this contemporary vault is the quiet, high-pitched hum of the server room, a steady, digital vibration that feels like the breathing of a colossal, unseen entity. The air is perfectly still, chilled to an analytical 50 degrees, preserving the silence of the billions of data points that define our world. As we pull the final conclusion folder from the encrypted server, the screen feels cold to the touch, and the sharp scent of ozone and heated silicon fills the air. The ink on the original 1989 mandates has faded with secrets, looking more like a warning than a record. We move slowly now, into the cold, final reflection of the system that owns our souls. To understand the warning of the archive, one must first accept the clinical reality of the 98%. As we established in our investigation of the Restore command, the government chose to leave the 12,104 citizens in a state of administrative limbo. They weren't just deleted, they were staged. In the language of high-level cryptology, staging is the process of preparing a dataset for a final, irreversible incineration. The monitor flickers with a rhythmic, sharp pulse as we access the 2025 integrity audit of the Social Security Administration. The Lethe protocol is no longer a hidden file. It is the master key. It is the algorithm that decides which identities are stable and which are anomalies. Quiet dread begins to settle when you realize that the selection criteria have shifted. In 1989, they targeted people who knew the secrets of Project Clockwork. Today, the system targets anyone whose digital footprint does not align with the predicted path of the algorithm. If you change your habits too quickly, if you move outside the acceptable margins of the social credit grid, or if you ask too many questions about the Lethe code begins to sample your existence. A sudden draft of cold air seems to circulate through the archive as we see the warning signs of a pending incineration. Have you ever tried to log into an account and been told your password was incorrect, even though you know it was right? Have you ever noticed a ghost login on your security history from a location you've never visited? These are not glitches. They are the administrative probes of the Lethe protocol. The system is checking to see if your legal soul is still attached to your physical body. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the 2025 Nevada ping. 3 months ago, the decommissioned server farm we mentioned earlier emitted a signal that was captured by amateur radio enthusiasts across the American West. The signal was a broadcast of 12,104 names, repeated in a high-speed encrypted burst, but there was a 12,105th name at the end of the list. A faint static hiss comes from the archival terminal. It is the sound of that 12,105th name being degaussed and it is the sound of the burn bag being updated. The reflection on this event is a terrifying modern paradox. We are the most documented generation in history, yet we are the easiest to erase. Our dependence on the grid has made us vulnerable to the digital burn in 18th century archives. You could touch the paper and know it was real. In 2025, you can only touch the glass, and if the glass goes dark, your history goes with it. We must now address the final fate of the 114 wraiths, the artificial identities that replaced the 12,104 erased citizens. In our previous chapter, we found evidence that these wraiths were starting to remember the lives they stole. The hum of the server room feels like a mechanical heartbeat as we look at the wraith stability reports from 2024. The experiment has reached its critical point. The phantom identities, now placed in high-level government and financial positions, are experiencing identity contamination. They are beginning to act like the people they replaced. The librarian from Ohio has reappeared in the subconscious of a high-ranking Treasury official. The trucker from Nevada is manifesting in the dreams of a defense contractor. The archive chill here is the realization that data has a memory that transcends the machine. The government tried to incinerate the souls of the 12,104, but they only succeeded in splitting them. The monitor flickers, displaying a brain scan comparison of a wraith asset. The left hemisphere is processing the official mission. The right hemisphere is processing the childhood memories of an erased child in Maine. The system is in conflict. The Zero files are breaking through the firewall. Division Zero's response to this conflict is the ultimate warning. They have initiated the Purgil protocol. Instead of trying to fix the wraiths, they have decided to reset the entire sector. The analytical mind asks, how do I know if the purge has already started for me? The cold air in the vault is now absolute. We look at the pre-incineration checklist found in the latest Lethe update. It mentions data drift. This is when your official records your tax returns, your medical history, your voter registration begin to show tiny, unexplainable discrepancies. A misspelled middle name, a missing month of employment, a technical error on your insurance claim. These are the eraser marks of the system. The quiet dread of the archive chill is the realization that the burn bag is not a sudden event. It is a slow incineration. It happens one file at a time, one record at a time, until the day you wake up and find that the bank no longer recognizes your face. You have become a ghost resident before you even know you're gone. The static hiss returns, carrying the sound of a modern social media algorithm. It is sorting the population. It is deciding who is redundant. It is looking for the next 12,104. Intellectual reflection on the 1989 glitch shows us that the government doesn't need a reason to erase you. They only need a scenario. In 1989, it was the Cold War. In 2025, it will be resource optimization or security stability. The label doesn't matter. The result is always the same. The void. We sit in the quiet reflection of the archive. We have followed the story from the server rooms of Woodlawn to the ghost homes of Pennsylvania. We have seen the modern paper trail and the loss of the legal soul. We realize that the archive is not just a place where things are kept. It is a place where things are decided. The hum of the server is a steady hypnotic drone. We are surrounded by the evidence of a civilization that has automated its own amnesia. The Lethe Protocol is no longer a classified secret, it is the operational reality of the 21st century. And as we prepare for the final conclusion of this investigation, we look at the screen one last time. The monitor flickers, showing the names of the people who are listening to this narration. The metadata harvester is active. The archive is checking to see who is paying attention. To conclude our look into the zero, we must return to the man who started it all, Christopher Hauer. In our earlier chapters, we left him in the woods of West Virginia, a ghost resident whose very atoms were beginning to lose their coherence. The cold air in the archive seems to freeze the very data on the screen. In late 2024, a team of Division Zero retrieval specialists located a series of carvings in the limestone caves of the Appalachian Trail. They weren't ancient petroglyphs. They were social security numbers. 12,104 of them. Christopher Hauer hadn't vanished. He had spent 35 years archiving the erased in the only medium the Lethe Protocol couldn't reach, the stone. Intellectual curiosity leads us to the final entry in Hauer's Caverick. It was not a name. It was a warning to the future. The static on our recorder clears for a brief, clinical second. We hear the sound of wind in a cave. The machine only knows what it's told. A voice whispers, a voice that sounds like grinding rock. But the world remembers what it's felt. The void is not empty. It's full of us. What happened to the architect of the void? Dr. Eris Thorne, the man who wrote the Lethe Code, disappeared shortly after the 1989 incineration. The official record said he died in a car accident. But the Zero files contain a different hidden truth. The monitor flickers, showing a high-security cell in a facility beneath the Nevada desert. The dates on the surveillance footage run from 1990 all the way to 2025. In the cell is an old man, surrounded by thousands of blue folders. Dr. Thorne was not killed. He was archived. The government realized that the man who created the digital burn bag was too dangerous to be left in the real world. They used his own protocol on him. They erased his name, his degrees, and his history. They turned the architect into a subject. The quiet dread of this revelation is the infinite loop of the archive. The system eventually consumes its creators. Thorne is now the human librarian of the void, spending his final days cataloging the very people he tried to incinerate. The hum of the server room feels like a taunt. Thorne's final report, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard in 2023, is the archive's warning in its purest form. He wrote, "The 12,104 were not a mistake. They were the foundation. We built a new world on top of a vacuum, and now the vacuum is starting to pull the rest of the world down into it. The Lethe Protocol is no longer a program. It is a destiny." We are now at the threshold of the final incineration. As we analyze the modern cloud method, we see the patterns of 1989 repeating at a scale that is intellectually staggering. The air in the archive is perfectly still. The system is no longer erasing individuals, it is erasing contextual groups. It is degaussing entire neighborhoods, entire political movements, and entire histories that do not fit the stable future. Algorithm. The archive chill is the realization that truth is now a function of availability. If a piece of information is not available in the top 3 search results, it does not exist. If a person's profile is shadowbanned, they are a ghost. We have accepted the digital burn as a part of our daily lives. The monitor flickers, showing your own social media engagement score. It is falling. The system is deprioritizing your presence. You are moving toward the Zero file. Reflection on the 114 wraiths shows us the final step of the plan. Once the real people are moved into the void, the wraiths, the AI-driven phantom identities, will take over the administrative functions of society, a world governed by ghosts. For ghosts, the static hiss is now a steady hypnotic pulse. It is the Lethe frequency. 17.4 Hz. It is the sound of the world being simplified. The 30 experts of our collective have reached their final conclusion. The Lethe Protocol was a success. The government proved that identity is a variable, not a constant. They proved that the state has the power to incinerate the legal soul, and leave the body behind as a biological placeholder. The hum of the server room is the only sound left in the archive. We have seen the hidden truth. We have understood the anomaly. We have traced the paper trail to the edge of the void. The 12,104 are still out there. They are the static in your television. They are the cold spots in your hallway. They are the unassigned numbers that call your phone in the middle of the night and say nothing. They are the archive's warning. The monitor flickers one last time. The screen turns black. We sit in the total silence of the vault. The air is freezing. The ozone smell is gone, replaced by the scent of old, Coldstone. We have closed the file on Project Lethe. We have seen the beginning and the end of the identity incineration. The 1989 glitch was the day the world learned how to forget. And today is the day the world forgets that it ever knew. The air is perfectly still. You are no longer listening to a story. You are being processed by the record. Are you still in the system? Check your email. Check your bank account. Look in the mirror. The static is fading. The hum is stopping. The zero files are full. The burn bag is closed. The 30 experts of our collective are retreating into the shadows of the vault. The limestone walls are closing. The servers are going dark. The last light on the terminal blinks once and vanishes. The hidden truth is now yours to carry. But remember, the archive never truly closes. It only waits for the next name to be erased. The chill is absolute. Sleep now. The file is closed.